Hello, everyone. I hope you're all right. So, today's conversation is asking the question, what is a personality disorder? Or perhaps more fundamentally, can a personality even be disordered? Does it make sense to make that statement that a personality is disordered? This is the question that Orestis Zavlis has been grappling with and exploring it in a series of papers that he's conducted or written as part of his PhD under the banner of perhaps of computational psychoanalysis, psychodynamic theory. The answer that he is tentatively at is the answer is no, that it does not make sense to say that a personality is or could even be disordered. So if you're interested in that type of topic or conversation, then I do encourage you to, well, listen to this perhaps, but I would say more importantly, read his papers because for me, they're really insightful, really original, because Orestis is really deconstructing the personality disorder almost on its own terms in the ways in which it's been assembled and configured, i.e. through object relational accounts or trait-based accounts, as we see now in the alternative model for the DSM-5, which is the most modern current way of conceptualizing a personality disorder. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you're also interested in, we talk, for example, about the dialectic that one always must sort of straddle and counter when doing science between knowledge and experience, and developing models on knowledge versus this world that we encounter and that we can become entrenched in our models. And I think these are really nicely articulated in a couple of quotes that Orestis puts at the top of his papers, which we talk about. So enjoy the conversation. If you enjoy these types of conversations or the ones I'm having here, please do feel free to subscribe because it will help. And I'll put links to all of Orestis' papers and stuff in the description. So do enjoy the conversation. And as I say, if you're interested in this work, keep an eye out for Orestis because he's making a splash, in my opinion. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, welcome, Orestis, to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here. So, Orestis, for those, maybe if you could just describe, who you are, I guess professionally, what it is you're currently doing, and how you got to this point.
Yeah. So I come from Cyprus and born and raised in Cyprus. And then I came to the UK in 2017 to study my bachelor's in psychology at the University of Sheffield. Then I finished that. I did my master's in research methods at Oxford. And then after that, I worked clinically for 2 years. And my goal was to apply for the doctorate in clinical psychology and become a clinical psychologist. But then along the way, I realized it's quite difficult to get into that one. I was working and I was applying for the clinical psy, failing as well. And then I applied also for a bunch of PhD programs. I failed in to get to some of those as well. But then somewhat like randomly, after emailing the unit of psychoanalysis specifically, but also like Department of Psychology at UCL, I was just emailing them to see like what is the procedure, how can I do a PhD maybe at UCL, and then they were very friendly, replying back, and we set up interviews. I got an interview. I got accepted at UCL. Then I got funding from UCL. I was very lucky to get funding as well. And now I am at UCL. I'm a PhD student at UCL. This is the third year. So from this September onward, this is the third year. Usually the last year of the PhD says there's going to be a fourth year. I have funding for 4 years, so that's a good thing because I need it, I think, to finish the PhD. And yeah, I mean the PhD itself, initially when I was applying and I wrote a proposal and I sent it to UCL, it was about just psychoanalysis in general, borderline personality disorder more specifically, but then also intersecting with computational science. So what I proposed, which was a bit novel at the time, was that psychoanalysis is about mechanisms of the mind. To put it like briefly, it's about mechanisms of the mind, specifically unconscious mechanisms of the mind, basically mechanisms that you're not aware of, to put it in simple terms. So what I proposed is that what if we were to construct mathematical models about how those processes operate, so that we can actually like test them empirically, because a lot of the claims of psychoanalysis are not, you know, empirically. I mean, the treatment itself is empirically validated, but the mechanisms by which it operates are not well, you know, established. So as an example, like splitting, which is, you know, idealizing someone and then devaluing them, is not really like, of course you can see it clinically, you kind of know it's there, but you don't actually, there isn't any research testing that. So that's what I would propose. But then when I came and I started talking to Peter Fonagy, I started to realize that the field has much more fundamental issues, and that just, you know, doing computational models of very specific processes, you know, that's also important. It's not that's not important, but it's a much more specific and granular thing. And I kind of shifted my focus. I was more interested in general questions like what is personality, number one, and could there even be a disorder of personality? Not is there such a thing, but could it even exist as a thing that we can define properly and that we can investigate? And the answer that I came up with is that there can never be such a thing as a disorder of personality. We can discuss it later, but so it shifted to that, and that's what I'm doing right now. More like more philosophical, more theoretical, but there is still some empirical research coming up soon. So let's see. Yeah, that's it's a bit of a long introduction, but hopefully it's enough.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. That's really interesting and revealing. And yeah, I'm really glad that it's really nice to hear, you found a sort of a space which you're sort of flourishing in, which I think is really evidenced by, because I wasn't actually too sure if you were a PhD student or you'd sort of finished, but it's kind of a little surprising to hear that you're currently a PhD student, given how sort of prodigious your output has been. You seem to be, you've written several papers now, actually around personality, sort of more specifically, but then as I alluded to before, you were I think there's papers you've done on like network analyses and related to interesting like the mentalizing stuff as well, and resilience around COVID. But anyway, so yeah, that's really interesting as well to hear about the as you say, yeah, like psychodynamic therapies have been empirically supported, but the actual mechanisms are sort of less. And I think we'll get onto that, particularly with the paper you did on the generative modeling.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I have two questions though, and this is more. This is just because they really resonated with me. And so in two of your
Yes.
papers, on two of your papers at the top, which many people often do, you've put two quotes, and they're from each. One is from there's two from different papers, and to me there's a continuity with them, but maybe for you not. So the first
Mm.
one is the greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. And that's Daniel
Yeah, yeah.
Borstein. And the other one was believe those who are seeking the truth, doubt those who find it, and that's Andre Gide. So why did you choose these, or what do they mean to you?
I mean, I was hopefully I wasn't being too dramatic, to be honest. But the reason I chose, I mean, okay, so the first one is about the illusion of knowledge, I guess, and I chose that one specifically because every time I mean, when I came to the field, I wasn't really an insider. I just wanted to learn more. So I was going around, I was asking people like a very, very simple question. Um, which I actually put it now on my Substack. Basically, how do you define personality disorders? Like, what's the definition? I just wanted to understand, you know, before I even met the people who were actually diagnosed with these disorders, right? I just went around asking clinicians, researchers, everyone, and I was getting like very inconsistent answers. I was also getting a bit of a, defensive stance. Like when I was trying to kind of like push back and say, you know what, but this doesn't really make sense. You know, this is a bit, I was, I'm also a bit blunt as a person. I just say it the way it is, like it doesn't make sense to me. And I kept pushing back. And I just felt like a lot of people in this field, specifically in this field, I don't know if it's psychology, if it's a problem with psychology broadly. People talk about anti-psychiatry. If anything, I'm anti-psychology sometimes. But yeah, so I was just getting a lot of pushback, and I just realized that maybe these people already have made up their minds. There's nothing I can say or do or that would convince them otherwise. Maybe there
Mm,
is. Maybe if I so right now, what I'm doing with my PhD is I'm doing three empirical studies. You need at least three to get a PhD, I think. So I'm doing
Right.
three empirical studies, and I'm trying to see, I'm testing the idea of a personality disorder. Could there even be a coherent definition of personality disorder, or could it be more specifically defined? And by that, I mean, maybe it's an emotional disorder, maybe it's a relational. To be honest, I haven't made up my mind either. My fundamental thesis is not that actually personality disorders are relational disorders, as some of my papers have already suggested. My thesis is that um, there is no evidence that there is such a thing as personality disorder. That is the main thesis. And then
Right.
maybe we can test it and then we can find some evidence, or maybe we can test it and we don't find evidence, But that's the main argument. So the argument
Mm.
is an anti-argument in some way. And so yeah, the first quote about the illusion is about the fact that, people have already made up their mind. They already think that
Mm.
it's about personality traits. So there is a class of theories. I don't mind naming them: Donald Lynam, Donald Whittiger, Josh Miller, people like that, and they define it as, it's about personality traits. This is completely wrong, and I showed that it's wrong. Some people call it personality functioning, which doesn't, it's very ambiguous concept. It's not very well defined either. And in fact, personality functioning is evident across many mental disorders. So if you were to define personality disorders based on personality functioning, then you reach the conclusion that every mental disorder is a personality disorder,
Sure.
right? So it's another illogical definition. So that's my
Yes.
argument, that their definitions are illogical. It doesn't make any sense.
Yes. We
And
can get
then,
onto that as well and explore that more.
exactly, yeah. And then what was the second quote? I forgot the
The
second quote.
second one is Andre Gide, and it's believe those who are seeking the
Yeah.
truth, doubt those who find it.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess you're right. They are connected because if you already think you have the right definition and you
Mm.
don't test your definition, right?
Mm.
Then then I wouldn't believe someone who's very dogmatic, let's just say, about anything.
Sure.
That's
Are you familiar? It's really interesting to hear that, and it makes a lot of sense. It just makes me wonder. Have you heard of Iain McGilchrist?
who is that again?
Iain McGilchrist.
No, not
He's
really.
not related to like this what we're talking about specifically, but
Hmm.
he's one of those few people I sort of would encourage anyone to read. But he's sort of he's written a book called The Master and His Emissary, and then he's written more recently one called The Matter with Things. He's a psychiatrist, but he's really a philosopher actually in many ways. But in the former book, the main thesis of it, but he sort of he reticulates this using neurological, neuroscientific, neuropsychological studies as well. But basically, is that the different hemispheres have different ways of attending to the world, and that
I've heard of that idea. I've heard of the idea, not the person. Yeah.
yeah, and it's just really interesting. And he basically, this is broad, very broad and coarsely speaking, but that the left hemisphere is very much concerned with, sort of its own understanding and the models that it has. So it sort of
Mm,
takes to the world what it already knows, whereas the right hemisphere is much more sort of concerned with,
exploratory.
yeah, and presencing and allowing the world to disclose itself. And it also very much reminds me of Bion spoke of like K and O and like how we have this need for knowledge, but actually there is also this sort of ineffable space which we need to be sort of open to. And those quotes just made me think of those two, which is this like it is that dialectic, isn't it? It's like we need models,
Exactly.
but the field can become entrenched in these models, which is what it sounds like you were just sort of saying, what these quotes meant to you.
Yes. No, you nailed it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, it goes back to the idea whether scientists are actually objective seekers of truth or whatever, or whether they're more, whether they have their own biases. I have my own
Mm,
biases, of course. Maybe I'm biased in some way, and maybe I guess what we need in this field and also science more broadly is everyone testing each other's models. So I would expect that, if I put my thesis out and people read it, I expect to be scrutinized myself. And if I made a mistake, I want other people to correct me. I want other people, I just basically want people to test things and be more critical. I don't want them to be very dogmatic in a particular thesis. And if they are, then they should be scrutinized, as should I in some way. Yeah.
yes. Okay. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean that's the sort of spirit of science, isn't it, really? But like we all know. science is conducted by humans, and we're all prone to becoming attached to theories,
Your
models.
idea, yeah, to your own, which is not even your idea, I guess, in some way, because there are no original ideas anymore. Yeah.
That's it. Say that again. There's no original ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I discussed this with Peter. I said I'm very pessimistic because every idea that I have, that I think I have, right? I
Mm,
read like, a psychoanalyst in the 50s or 60s or whatever, and I find that they've discussed the exact same thing, but just using different terms. And there's this other idea
yes,
in
yes.
psychology, jingo and jango fallacy, whatever it's called, that, we are constantly reinventing new concepts, but we're just giving them new names, basically. That's what we're doing. So we are reinventing things that already existed. Maybe not so much in other sciences, although you do see that in other sciences. So in philosophy and even computer science, you see some people. I mean, Wittgenstein was, famous in that when he wrote the Philosophus Tacticus, whatever it is.
Yeah, the
In the
Tractus.
beginning, he says, yeah, I'm not concerned whether my ideas are actually, they have been articulated before, so I'm not going to cite anyone. Like I don't care, yeah. So, but they are, a lot of ideas have already been invented in some way. I guess in the humanities, I guess, or in the social sciences, and we are reinventing them, giving them a different take, maybe. I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes. And to be honest with you, yeah, I identify with that a lot. Yeah, I think I have an idea, and I'm like, is that my idea, or have I sort of like picked that up somewhere else? And then I might have an idea. Like I like to sometimes write just almost as so for example, I've written a couple of like draft sort of manuscripts for papers. They're far from being anywhere near where they could be sort of considered to be published, but and one of them was actually around you I think find this
Hi,
interesting.
I think it lagged for a second.
Oh, okay, that's fine. So yeah, I was just, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So what I was just saying was, thanks for saying. What I was just saying was, yeah, I resonate with that. And actually, because interestingly, recently I've been thinking about. So Peter Fonagy was in a recent introduction to a book was talking about how mentalization-based theory has sort of eschewed or the drives, and he sort of talks about it's scotomized its psychoanalytic roots. And so then I
Exactly.
was thinking, oh right, well, in mentalization-based theory, it would very is there a way for it to integrate the drives? And that was what I found really interesting in reading your paper, the generative model one, was you sort of it's not the focus of it, but buried within the paper, I think is a sort of an intimation towards that, which we'll get onto, which is around where you talk about benevolence
Mhm.
and malevolence of the intentionality of mental states. But anyway, it's just, yeah, it's really interesting to hear another person say that, because sometimes I'm thinking, am I just sort of losing my mind? Are these my ideas? Are they someone else's ideas? Um,
No, no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, the first time I came up with the term relational disorder, I thought I was, oh my God, this is amazing. I just thought about it. And I was like, oh, does it actually exist? And I just started Googling. I remember I was on the bus and I was Googling, is there such a thing as a relational disorder? And it turns out there is. It's even in the DSM. People don't know this.
right.
And yeah, yeah, and it's a diagnosis that sometimes people make when in family systems therapy when a child is being disruptive, right? They instead of diagnosing the child as having a conduct disorder or something, they say no, you have a specific relational disorder with this particular person. So this relationship is disorder, not the person.
Oh, that's so
Um,
interesting.
it
And do you
already
know what?
exists, yeah, yeah.
And that makes me think. This just come to my mind. I could be wrong here, but I think I'm. I don't think I'm. I think attachment, right? So how we talk about attachment styles. I think
Mhm.
originally attachment actually was also like that. So when we said somebody was insecurely attached, it was with regards to a particular relationship. But
Oh
then
yeah,
right, but then what's ended up happening is we've sort of codified it within the person to say, well, it's just them, and they're like that with everyone. Actually neglecting that, like, which I think your work goes on to speak to, but it's the more nuance of, well, what about the other to self rather than just self to others?
exactly,
Um,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, now it's interesting because attachment research is shifting again. They've done meta-analysis and they've shown that, yes, you're not like that with every other person. You're not insecurely attached with every single person. If you
mm.
find the right partner, they can make you secure. You can make them secure, you know? So it's interesting. Yeah. It's definitely not it's not a property of, it is a property in some way, but it needs something to activate it, if you will. So it's something
Sure.
within you, some capacity, and then it activates in particular circumstances.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so all right. I wonder if we sort of, well, I say start. I mean, we've been talking for minutes, but kind of around. Yeah, you sort of started to talk about it when asking you about the quotes you used, and this was around this illusion of. I think it's the illusion. Well, the paper. One of the papers is Beyond the Illusion of Personality Disorder, and that you've cited, you say, namely that researchers in the field of personality disorder suffer from a cognitive bias which you've termed the illusion of personality pathology. That is a tendency to denote all individual differences as personality differences. So yeah, could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a bit controversial. The funny thing is that I tried to publish it, and it didn't get good reviews. I kind of understand the reviews that came from though. I actually, if the people who reviewed it can are listening to this, I'm very grateful for all of the reviews. I didn't, to be honest, the idea is interesting, and I need to rewrite that paper much more in a more specific way. Maybe I can explain it better than I wrote it
Sure.
in the paper. But so some of the reviews were that, oh my God, you're saying that there is no such thing as personality. Like, what are you doing? Like, what are you're denouncing, decades of research. That's not what I'm saying. Okay, let me just start with that. I'm not saying there's no such thing as personality. I'm saying that um, the definition that we have of personality pathology makes no sense logically, right? And I can elaborate. So what happens with some definitions of personality pathology, not all of them, but some of them, they define it based on personality traits, right? And right off the bat, I just said personality traits, but actually they're not personality traits. You can define them specifically. So as an example, you have neuroticism, right? So neuroticism is this tendency, you can define it very easily. It's a tendency to experience negative emotion, right? And it could be very temperamental, so it comes from your genes, or it could be very environmental in the sense that, you have a very difficult upbringing and therefore you're more sensitive to negative emotion, right? But the idea is the same. You are sensitive to negative emotion, you're more likely to experience negative emotion. So what is this trait? Is it a trait of personality? I would say it's an emotional trait, right? And that's very important. Then you move on to another trait, like, I don't know, like impulsivity. So impulsivity is acting without thinking, therefore it's a behavioral trait. You can call it a behavioral trait, and so on and so forth. So my argument is that the field of personality has taken all of these traits, they call them personality traits, and then they say that you have a disorder of personality to the extent that those traits deviate from a normative baseline. So to the extent that a trait is very extreme and it's very maladaptive, then you have a disorder of personality. And my argument is that if you, this is a definition, by the way, this is an actual definition. It's actually even implicit in the DSM, and many researchers to this day argue for this definition, which makes zero sense, by the way. And the reason it makes zero sense is because if I take this definition, then I can show that all mental disorders are actually personality disorders, right? So, and the way to show that is by looking at each trait. So it's by looking at, sorry, every mental disorder and how every mental disorder has at least some maladaptive personality traits, right? So as an example, depression has extreme neuroticism. In fact, they're synonymous. If you have extreme neuroticism, you're more likely to be classified as a neurotic person, therefore as a depressed
Mm.
person, anxious person, and so on, right? If you have extreme openness to experience, another five-factor trait, the maladaptive version of openness is psychoticism, and is this ability to be, it's not an ability, but it's this having expanded consciousness and basically being very creative, being very eccentric in your thinking, right? And that if you push that to its extreme, it becomes psychosis, it becomes bipolar disorder. That's why there's also a genetic link, not even a correlation, a genetic link between creativity and bipolar and psychosis. They're the same thing. They're actually like the same dimension of human experience, which is creativity, openness to experience, and so on, underpins both of them. So another trait of personality, which leads to psychosis, is what I'm saying. Another trait would be conscientiousness, right? If you're very conscientious, very hardworking, you become a workaholic. There's also a workaholic disorder. That's a personality disorder under this definition, if we use this definition. Now, if you push it to its opposite extreme, it becomes impulsivity. So you're not conscientious, you are more lazy, quote unquote, or you don't regulate well your behavior. Let's just put it in more formal terms. Therefore, you're more impulsive. Therefore, you're more likely to suffer from substance abuse or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So that's another personality disorder for you. And so on and so forth for every mental disorder. You have eating disorders. Eating disorders are also about emotions. Now there's models that are trying to conceptualize them as maladaptive emotion regulation strategies. You're trying to seek control in uncontrollable situations, and then you find, this outlet, which is your weight management, and that gives you a sense of purpose, sense of control. It's an emotional disorder, therefore it's a disorder of neuroticism, therefore it's a disorder of personality. So what I've just shown very briefly, and you can do that for every mental disorder, what I've shown briefly right now is that every mental disorder is equally personality disordered, right? So if you take personality traits and you just look at them and you just make a catalog of every person on the planet and their mental disorders and their personality traits, you will find that specific mental disorders are rooted. They're not just correlated. They're actually rooted within personality traits, within specific personality traits. So what I'm saying about the illusion of personality is that we need to stop using the term personality traits. We need to stop using the term personality differences. We need to stop using the term personality pathology because it masks the specificity of each trait.
Yes.
So what we can do instead, now that I've just outlined all these, all these different traits, we can call them for what they actually are. So the neuroticism is an emotional trait. Therefore, you have an emotional problem. I'm not even going to call it emotional disorder. I'm going to call it emotional problem for now. If you have openness, creativity, whatever, and it becomes extreme and it turns into psychoticism, which is the extreme variant of openness, then you have a psychotic problem. You have, which is actually even more specifically because people are trying to move away from the psychotic, as a label. You can call it cognitive perceptual problem. It's the correct term. So even more specific, you have a cognitive perceptual problem, a problem with thinking, and a problem of perceiving reality, literally. If you have an impulse problem, if you have a behavioral problem, that's an impulse problem. So you can call it an impulse disorder or impulse problem with substance use and ADHD. And again, so every mental disorder can be classified using these specific terms. And then you understand that, yeah, every mental disorder is equally personality disorder, but if we just use each personality trait, if we define it specifically, we will find that these traits fall in these disorders. And then you ask, okay, where do the personality disorders fall? And then what we see is that they're specifically rooted in the relational traits of personality. So, for example, how humans navigate relationships. Do they wish to be disagreeable or agreeable? Do they wish to be introverted or extroverted? Those are the major two ways, the major two traits that define disorders of personality. And those traits are interpersonal traits, they're social traits, they're relational traits. So therefore, disorders of personality are actually disorders of relationships.
Yeah.
This is the argument. It's a bit too much. Maybe I can elaborate later on, but there's other related ideas, and there's a reason why there is still a term personality disorder. It's because it's conflating other ideas. So they're usually conflating the idea of a character disorder, which is a different thing.
Okay, yeah, we can get onto
But
that.
we'll get there. Yeah.
So am I right in saying that in a way you're starting? So you start in almost deconstructing personality disorders. You've come at it sort of starting with how personality is currently defined generally in regards to mental health disorders or difficulties, psychopathologies, and then working your way into like the way in which then DSM and maybe implicit in the more recent alternative models, you've got actually some of the sort of psychodynamic, like Kernberg's personality functioning, or have you started what I'm so how does that make sense what I'm getting at? And then you're going into that and saying,
Yes. So It's starting from first principles actually, and
Right.
in essence, what I was trying to understand is again, right, what's the definition of personality disorder, right? And I was getting a definition. One of the definitions is what I just said, which is different personality traits. So to the extent that you have these traits, you have a disorder of personality, and it didn't make sense to me. What I showed is that this definition is illogical. So I started from a definition of personality, the most basic definition of personality, which is your way of thinking, feeling, behaving, relating. Your way of
Right.
thinking is openness to experience, feeling is neuroticism, behaving is conscientiousness. These are the big five traits. And relating is detachment, antagonism, whether you're detached or whether you're antagonistic with others.
Hmm.
So, so I started with the definition of personality. And then I saw, okay, what's the definition of personality disorder? And then I saw there's a mismatch there as well.
Ah, yes.
And there's in the sense again, in the sense that the let me just explain it this way, maybe. I saw that the definition of personality is so general that it can never define a specific disorder of personality without painting all of the disorders, all of the mental disorders as personality disorders. Right?
Yes.
Again, it's like you're using a big pot to define something very specific. And it just doesn't philosophically and logically makes no sense. Right. And this is
Yes.
the problem with Kernberg's model as well. In fact, Kernberg, maybe I should write a critique on Kernberg or something, but Kernberg himself, he says personality is this big thing, right?
Mm.
And he even includes IQ in that big thing. He says IQ is also
Yes.
part of personality, right?
Yes.
Intelligence and other things like that. And fair enough, yeah, fair enough, that's personality. But then when he defines personality disorders of personality, he focuses specifically on object relations, right? So this is what I'm saying is that we define personality in big terms, and that's okay, that's great. That is personality, of course. Um, but disorders of
Yes.
personality, whenever we go to define disorders of personality, we cannot use all of personality. We're using specific things of personality, and we're saying, "Oh, it's
Yeah.
about this, about," and then it stops being about personality. Then it starts becoming about specific aspects of personality, and those specific aspects are usually emotional and relational. That is also why we call them complex emotional needs, right? So this is the logical fallacy that's happening. Personality is this big thing. In fact, actually, right now we're doing a study, and we're asking people just out of curiosity. I was like, I'm asking people, okay, what is your personality? Like, can you just give us two or three big, dimensions of your own personality? Forget about everything, just your own. And then usually people say, obviously they say I'm an introvert, I'm an extrovert, the basic traits that everyone knows, right? But they're also saying, it's this kind of hobbies that I have. I like playing basketball, for example. I'm an athletic person, or it's the fact that I like sushi. I don't know, or I like rock, or hip hop, or whatever kind of music you enjoy, right? So they say these things, and these things are not part of personality models. So again, this illustrates that personality is this big thing, right?
Sure. Sure.
And there can and my argument is that if you call something a disordered personality, then you're effectively just like painting all of this in a disordered way. Whereas what you are trying to say, what they are trying to say, the researchers, if only they have the words to say that,
Mm.
is that it's not the whole personality that's disordered, it's specific aspects. And then I'm
Yes.
saying, well, if it is actually specific aspects of personality that are disordered, then why don't we just redefine these disorders in those specific terms? And then we can keep our personality models. We can keep them separate. We can say, okay, here's a personality model. If you want to understand your patient using personality models like Kernberg's or other models, that's great. But that just helps you understand different ways of being in the world without
Mm.
necessarily saying that they have a disordered personality.
Yes. Yeah. And actually, I think
Yeah.
in a way, there's sort of two ostensibly two components to this, which you've argued both. And actually, if I'm correct, you've actually almost showed that they're in a way isomorphic, which is the personality functioning and the personality traits. But on that, so yeah, it's so interesting. Your work, I think, which is why I've really enjoyed it, is it's sort of deconstructing what so many people, I mean, I know I can't be alone in sensing, when, you first come into this sort of field of mental health, you have encounters with mental health and you see these terms of like someone saying, whether it's borderline personality disorder and you're like, really? What? So So their whole personality is disorder, like is that's what you're intimating. And I used to think, well, this is also kind of narrow-minded because personality, as you've just alluded to, it's so dimensional. There's so many ways of modeling it as well. You think of like MBTI, so you've got the kind of more Jungian approach to things of like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
extroversion, intuition, judgment, sensing, all those things. And so what are we also saying that's also disordered? Is that all? So
Exactly.
it's so non-specific, isn't it? The kind of the current
Exactly.
way of, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I feel like when patients protest against the term, that's what they have in mind. They say, it cannot just be all my personality, bro. Like it has to be something more specific. I'm
Mm,
coming to you and I'm saying I have emotional difficulties regulating my emotions, and specifically in the context of relationships, so very close and significant relationships. And now you're telling me I have a PD. Like
mm,
it just doesn't make sense. And I guess, yeah, I like to think of it. And when I rewrite this paper, and I have it planned at some point when PhD stuff are get out of the way, hopefully. Um, I want to separate three ideas, right? As you just said, this is very important. There's three different ideas, and I think all three ideas are conflated in the field, and that is why we've ended up with the term personality disorder. So maybe I
hmm.
can talk about that now, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So briefly, I mean, the first idea is what we just said, what is personality? Personality is anything and everything, like literally anything. You could actually come to me right now and you can say, and I think Adorno, this psychologist, a very, very long time,
Oh, I don't know.
the Adorno thing, that's his name. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. I think there's a philosopher called Adorno. Maybe I'm getting confused, but anyway.
Maybe he was also a philosopher, or maybe he was only a philosopher.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
But he said
Anyway,
something about personality. Anyways,
sure.
if I remember correctly. And then he said, like, okay, there's these things that we can model in the personality models, but then there's those like idiosyncratic things about each person. You have a dimension. I bet you have a dimension of personality that no other person in the world has. And then we get to
Right.
the idea that personality might actually, in fact, be consciousness itself, even in the sense that every single person is unique. We're not going to go there right now. Let's not go full philosophy, but the point is that it's so broad that it has many, many different dimensions. That's one
Mm,
idea, right? The second idea is what we've just been describing, like very diagnostic, very, very pragmatic disorders of personality, like, and as a diagnostic entity, which I argue they're disorders of relationships. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're emotional disorders. Maybe they're behavioral disorders. I don't know.
mm,
But my fundamental thesis is that they're not about personality. They're not
sure.
disorders of personality, right? My bet is that they're relational disorders, but they may very well be something else, right? We will see. And then there's the third idea, which is this very old idea dating back to literally ancient Greece when Theophrastus, a Greek philosopher, said he wrote this book about characters and he described a bunch of different characters. And
Mm,
he even used the term character disorder. And this is where the psychoanalysts, this is where the psychoanalysts came and said, these are not personality disorders, they're character disorders. This is very interesting. And the reason they're character disorders, not the second idea. So I believe the second idea is relational disorders. This is a different idea. It's a character disorder. It's character, if you define it, is the way you relate to others, and maybe also
mm,
the way you relate to yourself, but primarily the way you relate to others, right? So, as an example, if you're a prisoner and you're released early from prison, a couple of months early or even a year early, they say the judge usually says, "Oh, this person was released out of good character," which is to say that
yes.
they've become better as a person. There's a
Mm,
moral judgment there, right? Like this person was relating to others in a bad way. They were in prison because they were stealing people or whatever. Now they're released early because they're of good character, right? So this is what the character disorder is. It's a value judgment. I'm judging your character. I'm saying you're a bad person, yada, yada, yada. So these are the three ideas. In my opinion, they're completely different, and yet they're conflated. And so the first idea again is the personality traits idea. You're born with a collection of traits, you acquire certain traits, and this is just who you are as a person. And what many
mm,
people are seem to not understand is that yes, in mental health we can definitely have personality assessments, but they're not about pathology. Like yes, there are pathological traits, but it doesn't mean that those traits are about disorders of personality. because then every single person will be diagnosed with a disorder of personality. In fact, autism could very easily.
Because of the fact that many people there will fall there'll be an extreme there'll be
Exactly,
on what
exactly.
yeah
Exactly, because every single psychological dimension can have an extreme
yeah
extremity. And if you diagnose everyone using the terms, using the personality terms, which are pretty much identical to the mental health terms, like
mm,
emotion is the equivalent to neuroticism. Cognition is the equivalent to openness to experience, as I just said before. And behavior, cognitive behavioral therapy, it's equivalent to like conscientiousness mixed with neuroticism. So they're
mm,
actually identical. They're the same dimensions. They're the same
mm,
dimensions. That's why you have these hierarchical models of psychopathology. They put them together. They don't just separate
mm,
them. Personality and psychopathology are the same thing. They're the same thing. And so if you say to someone, you have extreme emotions, extreme behaviors, extreme this, extreme that, you are effectively saying you have extreme personality dimensions. But that's the
right
first idea. And that's why I'm saying if you say that if you define personality pathology in these terms, then every mental disorder becomes a personality disorder instantly, logically. That's what it is. And I'm
yes
arguing it shouldn't be. It should just be specified as you have extreme emotions, you have extreme behaviors, la la la. Um, the second, the second idea is what I just said before. If you classify each disorder based on the traits, you actually find that personality disorders are mostly about emotional traits and relational traits. And
mm,
therefore, it makes sense to redefine them like that. And then you get into the models like the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology,
mm,
right? For those of you who don't know, it's a taxonomy that uses dimensions to define mental disorders. So there's a dimension of emotion, as I just said, and under it there is disorders of emotion, anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, etc. There's a dimension of behavior, impulse control, and under that there is ADHD, there is substance use, sometimes antisocial stuff as well, because they're about
mm,
the way you're behaving, right? Then there's another dimension of psychoticism, which is again openness experience, right? And it's like the creative types, which if you push it to their extreme, they become delusional or they become a bit eccentric. This is interestingly, schizotype of personality is also under here because these are people who are a bit eccentric, right? A bit of a
mm,
loner and eccentric people. You have a psychosis, you have bipolar disorder. And then finally, you have two dimensions. They're interpersonal dimensions, and they are detachment and antagonism. Detachment is extreme introversion, being very withdrawn, not liking people. I dislike most other people. I don't trust them. So I'm kind of like withdrawn. And then the other one is not only maybe I don't like them, but I'm actually not withdrawn and I go in their face and I'm disagreeable, which is what you see with a lot of types in PD. They're very disagreeable. You tell them something and then they react. And then if you're not a clinician who understand, if you're a clinician who takes the things personally, you're gonna have a hard time dealing with these people because then you're gonna think, oh, why are you being so bad at me? I'm just trying to help you. Why are you doing this to me?
yeah
It's not doing it to you. It's just the way they are, the way they've been taught to be, the way they've learned to be in order to survive, actually. So
mm,
those are the two dimensions. They're interpersonal, relational dimensions, and they define the disorder of personality. So I just painted like with four or five different dimensions, pretty much the entire tapestry of psychopathology, right? And then there's the last idea. Let me just go back to the last idea, and then I can take a break and drink some water. Um,
yeah.
so the last idea, which is, I find it the most interesting idea, right? Because someone might say, and I've actually had this discussion with some researchers, Orestis, we agree with you 100%. They are relational disorders. I agree with you. They're about the ways of relating. I was like, oh, okay, they're nice, nice then. However, they're bad people, you know? And that's where the moral inference comes into play. So then there is a judgment, and they say, well, yes, they are relational. However, they're doing it, maybe they're not doing it fully intentionally, but it's their character, it's the way they were raised, it's this, it's that.
Really
Yes, yes.
researchers have sort of speaking like that
Yeah, I mean, researchers they have some clinical experience. Not all
wow
of them. I don't want to say like everyone is like that. Okay, let me just say out of that. Like
yeah sure I understand.
isolated instances. I wouldn't think that all of them think in this way.
I
So
mean, to be honest, I'm not. I say wow. I mean, I've kind of encountered similar things, but anyway, I've interrupted you there. But yeah, yeah.
no. It's a good clarification
It's
to make.
part. To
Yeah.
be honest, I think it's. I'm not that surprised at all. I mean, I've actually written a. I wrote a
Yeah.
I shared it with you, that sort of brief BPS blog thing, because
Yeah.
it's part of the kind of zeitgeist. I think, it's the sentiment many people have inherited probably from the people they worked with who've now left
No,
the field.
100%, yeah. And yeah, I mean that's very dangerous. And I'm not surprised either, but I'm disappointed not in them, but I'm disappointed
Of
in the
course, yes.
psychoanalysts. I'm disappointed in the psychoanalysts, to be honest, because the psychoanalysts had a really good opportunity to define them as relational disorders a long time ago, and they chose not to. And for that, I'm very disappointed because we know they're relational disorders fundamentally. Again, maybe they're emotional, who knows? But my thesis is that they're relational. But and the psychoanalysts know that. They know that deep down that they're relational. They
Mm,
define personality in very relational terms. Mentalising is a relational construct. Everything is relational, you know? I said to Peter, I said, I'm very disappointed in you that you didn't do anything about this. He said, we tried to call it emotional disorder. We reached as far as emotionally unstable personality, but they wouldn't get rid of the personality term. Fuck it. Sorry for the F word. Anyways, but
it's
yeah.
fine.
But regardless, the point is that I'm disappointed with the psychoanalysts because again, they could have termed them relational because they had the whole
Mm,
object relations theory, which is beautiful. They had the modern interpersonal relational psychoanalysis movement, very nice movement, and yet they
mm,
chose not to. And for that, I'm very disappointed because they instead chose to tell them character disorders. And this is kind of where this sentiment, I think, comes. We need a historian to tell us, to be honest. I don't know, but maybe there's going to be a historian at some point and see how these ideas evolved over time. But my bet would be that the moment the psychoanalysts started calling them character disorders, that's where all this moral inference came into play, whereby, you're trying to treat someone, maybe they're a victim of sexual abuse or physical abuse or whatever, and they're very
mm,
unstable. You say, why aren't you like a nice, perfect little victim so I can treat you? And why are you being so harsh to me as a clinician? Whatever. And then they say you have a BPD or whatever, right? So this is what's going on. Some people, I would say, don't know that they're making this inference. They think like, um, I think that most of the times people with diagnosed PD, they have this inference in mind. They say, I don't like you as a person. Therefore, there's something wrong with your personality, not my personality. My judgment would be that this is what's happening most of the times, not all of the times. But anyways, that's
mm.
that's what the last idea means. But just to clarify, just to tie everything up, right? And to separate the third idea with the second idea, right? Because again, some people they might agree with me that they're relational, but they
Mm.
would say, but they're about, but where do their ways of relating come from, Orestes? They would say they're coming from someone's character, like the way they were raised, their moral system.
Yes,
They were
yes.
taught to behave in this way, and yada yada yada. And my argument to that, I would say, is this. First of all, you can't have it both ways. A lot of psychoanalysts say a lot of these processes are very unconscious, they're unconsciously repeating the same relational patterns.
Mm,
Maybe for example, a person falls in love with their abuser and they stay with them even though the abuser is abusing them and yada yada
mm.
yada. Are you going to blame the victim? Are you going to blame, that's the idea. And so that the psychoanalyst there would say, well, it's unconscious and she's not doing it on purpose, but she's repeating the same pattern. So I'm saying then, well, character implies some form of consciousness, some form of like intentionality. I
Sure.
choose to do this because it's in line with my moral code. If it's not, if I'm doing something and it's bringing me suffering and I'm actually disagreeing with it on a rational level, then it's not part of my character. So that's my first argument, right? Like that a lot of these behaviors are unconscious,
Yes.
right? And just to illustrate with an example, think of it like, just to give an extreme example, think of Hitler as an example, right? Like what he was doing was very, very conscious. He wanted to exterminate certain populations, not just the Jews, but also homosexuals, people who have disabilities, many different kinds of people. That was a conscious decision that he made. That was part of his character. That was part
Mm,
of his moral system. He even said
mm,
that. He wrote a book about it. He said it
mm,
out loud. Like this is not an inference from that. I'm not making this, I'm not making an inference. I am reading what he's saying, and what he's saying is that this is part of my moral system. I believe this. I am doing this. So
mm.
therefore, I am right. I believe, and I can make the case, and a very easy case, that Hitler had a character disorder, which is different than a relational disorder, I would say, which is what right? So that's my distinction, that the character disorder implies intentionality. It implies that everything is well thought out. There's a plan. It's in line with your moral system. You have a moral system. If I ask you, you're going to say
Yes.
yes, yeah. Whereas what happens with a lot of victims of abuse, what happens with a lot of people who have BPD is that, and I'm not trying to draw a parallel, by the way, just to clarify, right?
Of
But
course.
they
Yeah, of course.
they they are relating to others I would say mostly unstable ways. They're not killing people, obviously, right? Like they're not. There's no parallel between Hitler and them. However, we think that they also have a character disorder. Some clinicians think they have a character disorder because they're relating to them in negative ways. But what I'm
Yes.
arguing is that those ways are completely non-intentional. They regret relating in those ways later on,
Yes,
and
yes.
they're not doing this, yeah, on purpose.
They're more ego dystonic, aren't they? Particularly, and just bear with me. I fine. Okay, so yeah, I'll come back to it. So you were saying about the character disorders. So um yeah, which is really interesting. And I think what you were saying then is around how there's this conflating them, and that people who are often given a diagnosis of, say, borderline personality disorder, their distress is, and their, how would you say, their behavior or the way they relate to people is at times more, I guess you could say, when they are, say, antagonistic or they end up hurting somebody, it's ego dystonic. And it's interesting actually because this kind of comes back to the Kernberg conceptualization of it, because he talks of it. I mean, this, his whole system is basically predicated on, particularly with like the borderline. I mean, that's a whole nother argument around the sort of the nomenclature in that. I was reading Nancy McWilliams yesterday actually, and she interestingly also has a gripe with borderline personality disorder for the very fact that it is sort of forgotten the original conceptualization being borderline personality organization, and then it's led to this sort of, anyway, that's sort of the history of the diagnosis. But the point being is that for Kernberg, he talks about BPO, so borderline personality organization, being, the person, how would you say, has encoded in their developmental history two sort of dissociated well, they experience two sort of dissociated segments of experience generally. One being the sort of super driven by the superordinate drive of the sort of libidic sort of life, sort of like play, pleasure, like positive affective experiences tied to a self-other representation, and that there's the negative segments of experience, so sort of anger, all those things, um, and that the borderline personality organization is sort of like this person split between these really like valent, polarized parts of
Yes.
experience. And that actually, what I think you were sort of suggesting is often people with a borderline personality disorder diagnosis are perhaps, whether you take a mentalization based theory to conceptualize the person's experiences and behavior, or you could do both with the Kernbergs, is that they're driven by, or them by these unconscious ways of relating, but they often, let's say they become angry, then they actually later feel regret because they're like, and that, coming back to your point about character, might be that their sort of super ego or their moral system is not one in which they actually are trying to hurt other people,
Exactly.
but it's because the fact that growing up, they were sort of, had disorganized, chaotic ways of relating to people. Yeah.
No, 100%, 100%. To be honest, I'm not super familiar with Kernberg's conceptualization. My vague understanding of it and the psychoanalytic tradition more broadly is that every mental disorder is actually a personality organization, right? Like the whole person is organized in a certain way in
Mm.
which when they behave, it brings them pathology. I wouldn't call that a personality disorder. I
Well,
don't
he
think
didn't even
they
use the
call.
term disorder. He didn't use the term
Yeah, exactly,
disorder.
exactly. Yeah,
Really
exactly, exactly.
interestingly, he
That's
organization.
exactly, exactly. That's the interesting thing. And actually, when I, yeah, I think it was Jonathan Shetler, who said this. Yeah, that in psychoanalysis they used to say, a person comes to me, I'm seeing the person, and the reason they would say it's an organization is because they were thinking of it holistically, as I just described before. The first idea, remember the personality traits idea, is that every person is a collection of traits. I'm looking at you, and I'm psychoanalyzing you in some way, and I'm looking at your traits, which bring you suffering, and then I'm saying you're organized in this particular way, and the whole
Mm,
point of the analysis is to kind of like disorganize you and organize you in a different way so that you can be
sure.
more productive. And that's also why there's this like tales in psychoanalysis, that people go into therapy to fix a relationship, and they end up like, leaving their relationship at the end of the treatment because they become a different person.
Mm,
They look the relationship with a new set of eyes in some fundamental way, and they just realize, this was a maladaptive relationship to begin with. It can never be saved, so I just need to leave it or something. So
mhm,
it's an interesting. So yeah, so that's what personality organization it means to me, I guess. Yeah, that the person comes, they're organized in a certain way, and we're gonna change some fundamental aspects of who they are, and that's
mm,
fine. That is actually the point of treatment. A lot of the times is to change who someone is, to change how they view the world fundamentally, quite fundamentally.
yes.
That's why it takes time as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And then just kind of come sort of bringing this Kernberg stuff back into what
Yes.
you're in your papers, right? Because you actually, because Kernberg's organizational sort of framework has actually in the DSM-5, my understanding is it's actually sort of implicitly been integrated in this sort of this idea of personality functioning,
Mm.
which because so you've been speaking about, and as you do in your papers, about the trait-based approach, in that, if personality disorders are just described by sort of extremities on of a personality trait, well then all psychopathologies can be cast as personality difficulties. But then you have also, whilst I know you just said, oh, I'm not super familiar with Kernberg, you have actually written about the personality functioning though, haven't you? And
Yes.
I'm right in saying that you've also shown that the personality, because the DSM-5 alternative model has actually
Mhm.
sort of used this dual aspect way of doing it, hasn't it? Whereby you define the person based on their personality functioning, which is, but interestingly, it very much speaks to what you're talking about, this relational aspect of self, the relationship a person has with their self. So that's like autonomy and identity, I think, maybe. And
Yeah,
then
yeah, yeah.
other, which is maybe intimacy and empathy.
Yes.
Which actually, I'm not going into details, but I'm pretty sure that does map onto the Kernberg's, broadly speaking, his organizational stuff.
Yeah, there is research actually linking them. So that's
Y-
actually true. They
y-
do overlap
Yeah,
considerably. Yeah.
yeah, I think I did read some stuff on that, right? But then there's this second aspect, which is based on the level of functioning, identify the particular traits that the person is manifesting, and it sort of maps it onto the ocean, the openness, but it sort of inverts it using psychoticism, inhibition, or some disinhibition, something like that.
Yeah.
But am I right in saying you've actually shown that they're actually essentially the same thing?
Sorry, you mean when you say the same thing, the personality functioning and the Kernberg stuff, or
No, the trait-based stuff. So that
oh, oh,
actually,
oh.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So they lead to the same conclusion, if that's what you mean, that every
right.
mental disorder is a I mean, to be honest, that one is a bit of an underdeveloped argument from my end. But
Okay,
essentially,
fine.
what I think is happening is that so the personality functioning idea is interesting. Okay, so again, think of it as the different personality traits, right? The way you feel, neuroticism, the way you think, which is openness, psychoticism, the way you behave, conscientiousness, disinhibition, impulsivity, whatever term you want to use, and the way
Hmm.
you relate to others. These are the broad personality dimensions. If you do, I don't want to go full statistics here, but the way they constructed the personality functioning scales, that's a whole different argument, by the way, that they didn't do it in a very good way, but whatever, is that they wanted to create something, some general factor that would unify all of these different personality dimensions, right? The way
Hmm.
you think, feel, behave, relate.
Hmm.
Um, and they did that, and it actually works. So intimacy maps onto agreeableness, empathy, also agreeableness, and also introversion. Then there is self-direction is another one. Self-direction maps on conscientiousness and neuroticism. So if you're very
Right.
conscientious, you have a good direction in life, right? Um, and what's the other one? Something with identity, as you said as well, which is actually completely mapping onto neuroticism. So it's a neurotic problem, actually, going back to the idea. So
Mm.
what I argued again is that if you just decompose personality functioning, that's one of the, I have many arguments on this because I don't like the construct at all. But if you deconstruct it, you just
So
see
which
how
construct you don't like?
the personality functioning,
Oh, right, yeah.
the alternative model personality functioning, which in the ICD-11 is just called personality severity. Like they just call it, they don't even care. They just, Peter Tyrer just calls it like severity. That's it. So but you can deconstruct it. You can just look at each item, and you can just
Mm.
see how there are aspects of each trait. And as I just said, if someone has identity problems, I wouldn't call them as having a personality functioning problem. I would say you have an identity problem. You
Mm.
don't know who you are. Let's figure out who you are. That's a neurotic problem. Historically, in psychoanalysis, there's always been a neurotic problem. A person comes
Mm.
and they don't know who they are, they're neurotic, If they come and they have empathy problems, they're relational problems. So you could in some way combine them and say it's maladaptive ways of relating to the self and maladaptive ways of relating to others. That's what I've done
Mm.
in the generative model. I was just trying to play around and see could we actually combine them. Even then, what I showed is that there are two different things actually. There is relating to the self and there's relating to others. And maybe they cannot be grouped together and called personality functioning. I don't think that you can group them together. I think that you can just view them separately because I feel like so. I don't know if if you're familiar with Sidney Blatt.
I don't know. I'm not particularly from. No, I'm not.
He has this really cool model. It's again personality model, but it's where he got the idea of like relating to the self, relating to others. So
Right.
he
Okay.
had those two dimensions, autonomy and relatedness. Freud used to call them power versus love, and Jung also I think called them power versus love, the two different archetypes. And other people call them by different names, autonomy versus mergence. So the idea of autonomy that they're relating to the self is a person who's very independent, kind of isolated as well, and they prefer to relate to themselves and be doing their own thing, just working, for example. They just
Mm-hmm.
only want to get ahead in life.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there's another type of person who wants to get along with other people. So they're primarily concerned with others. They want to relate to others. They're driven to relate to others. So they're dialectic. They're two different things that they're dialectic. Maybe you can combine them and call them personality functioning. Maybe you can combine them and call them personality organization, as Kernberg does. I don't know if he's doing the exact same thing and he has the same terms, but I think in my opinion, you can very much view them as kind of like independently, very interrelated, but
Mm.
dialectic and sort of like independent. So that there is
Yes. Yes. Definitely. Yeah.
so that there's a person who's very autonomous and away from other people, and they prefer to get ahead, like Elon Musk kind of thing,
Mm.
and only driven to succeed and to make and to just make money or whatever, or they want to get along, so they just really want to have the relationships. So that's a more dependent, borderline kind of way of being. You're primarily concerned with others. And here's the interesting thing: if you're primarily concerned with others, then you have an identity problem because you don't focus on yourself. And if you are only concerned with yourself and you're only driven to succeed in life, then you destroy your relationships with others, which is what Elon usually does. Just to briefly say that, as an archetype,
Mm.
so that's the dialectic that I'm interested in. I find this dialectic is so much more sophisticated, so much more interesting. I find Sidney Blatt's work amazing. If people are interested, they can just read Sidney Blatt. This is not my idea. This is actually his idea. It just might take a little bit using different language on the same idea as we said before.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, even when you're speaking there, we don't need to get lost in it now, but as you were talking about, this dialectic, and if one is sort of more focused on others, well, then you have an identity problem. I mean, naturally, what that evokes for me is just this kind of which is always there. It's the water we swim in, which we don't often see or forget that we're swimming in it, which is culture and the assumptions,
Mm.
of like these individualistic ways of being versus, and that again has been, I know is one of the major criticisms of um, psychiatric nosologies and stuff, is because they are very Western, they are very individualistic.
Exactly, exactly. And there's a funny story here actually. I was talking to some people from China, and I read sort of like they have their own DSM. They have their own like system. Um,
Right.
I don't know how they call it, but the Chinese DSM. I don't know. But and they said that initially when they were starting to build it, can't remember the date. I'm not going to say a date and be completely wrong in the history here. But when they were starting to build it, they didn't include borderline personality disorder because they thought, this kind of like way of being very dependent, of being having very enmeshed relationships, being a bit more. I would say if I were to describe these people, I would say they're very sensitive people. That's what I would say. I wouldn't say they're unstable or chaotic. I think intrinsically they're born and they're very sensitive. They grow up in an unstable environment, they internalize the
Mm,
instability, and then they just project it outward. But I don't think that they're intrinsic. I don't think a person is intrinsically unstable. I think they're sensitive, and then something happens during development and it just destabilizes them. And then they appear to have emotional instability. But we even have now, we have a formal theory of mood instability, and we show that even that there's computational modeling, and it shows clearly that if you're very sensitive, that's why you're very unstable, essentially, to put it in like the simplest terms. But anyways, the point is that in the beginning they said there is no such thing as borderline personality disorder. They didn't even diagnose it. But then later on, they found their own kind of like syndrome, and they
mm,
said, yeah, it exists, but they define it in a slightly different way. And I
mm,
think also the same thing happened in Japan, and they define it mostly. I was speaking to this other person, and she said, if I'm correct, the definition of borderline in Japan or something is a disorder that damages the self more than the other. So
right.
it's actually very interesting. It's actually more about the self. It's not about other people.
Yes. And this all to me, I think anyway, I mean, I see it, one of the major differences I see between the more traditional object relational approaches, which I love and I think have so much, have, helped, us understand much more, better anyway, what's, going on at times, and, develop therapeutic modalities such as transference focused psychotherapy and stuff. But the thing for me, how they differentiate from, maybe not quality, what's the word? Yeah, more quantitatively than qualitatively. I'm not saying they don't consider it at all, compared to mentalization-based theory, and which is why I absolutely love mentalization-based theory and the work of, Peter Fonagy and all his team and colleagues, and yourself now included in like the work, the papers you've been doing, which is, you can, I mean, I know you've co-authored with him, but it's also very, I mean, in the generative model, you're looking at it through this way, which is mentalizing. And the mentalizing based approach, it's so sensitive to the relational matrix, which one, I think there's a quote you say, in one of your papers, which is something like the self isn't personal. So something to that effect, it's like our self, who we are, the models that we have of ourselves and others. We didn't just bootstrap them up ourselves. We didn't just completely inherit them. The environment is always implicated. It's always implicated. And I
Exactly.
think, and that itself, I think, is really important, well, for many reasons, but it's obviously it's helped in the development of like mentalization based therapy and stuff. Maybe then we get on to that, and the computational stuff you did on that paper, and actually, yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, so should I talk about the paper and the model, and then the mentalizing approach in general?
Yeah, I guess so. And then maybe as well, if you could, just slightly, if you do start to talk about um, predictive processing and stuff like that, just giving a cursory
Overview, yeah.
definition of
So
what it is. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, the model itself is based on obviously like Fristonian ideas, but not necessarily. Um, Although it does have an element of that, because I think, I mean, obviously, like there's a lot of evidence supporting predictive processing. The idea, I mean, very briefly, maybe I can describe the model very like verbally. So first of all, the model comes from this tradition of understanding humans as always trying to predict what's going to happen next, right? So humans are these little scientists that have these hypotheses about what's going to happen, and they have them a priori, so they have them way before the things happen. And then they, in some ways, when they're very, very um, dogmatic or certain about their hypotheses, they see in the world. So Freud even said, a man, Freud or Young, I don't know actually, um, a man sees in the world what he carries in his heart, and it's basically that, it's that you have these beliefs, and you almost impose them on reality, and then you filter the world through those beliefs,
Hmm.
essentially. So in the context of relationships, how does that manifest? Well, think of it in this very simple case. You text your partner, and you were supposed to meet for coffee, let's just say, right? You have a coffee date, you text them, they don't reply, you text them again, they don't reply again. What's the first hypothesis? Again, it's a hypothesis, right? But it's a hypothesis generated from a very deep belief. Maybe you were
Hmm.
abandoned, when you were in childhood, or maybe in a previous relationship, in a previous romantic
Hmm.
relationship. So you generate a hypothesis, which is in this instance, is your version of the most likely explanation of why they're not replying, right? So a first hypothesis might be, well, they are busy, or maybe their phone is out of battery, but they're definitely coming. I believe they're coming. I know them.
Hmm.
They're not gonna just like stand me up. Or maybe your hypothesis is they don't like me anymore, they're bored of me, they're never going to come, or your hypothesis. So this is how we define, very in a cursory way, what predictive processing is. You're constantly generating hypotheses, and then you're looking at the data in front of you, and you're updating them, right? You're updating your beliefs.
Yes, based on your prior experiences.
Exactly, exactly. So any event is not really just the event. It's not like any event has meaning, and you ascribe meaning to that. So I look at it more philosophically, like there is meaning in everything that we see and everything that we do, and you ascribe that meaning based on your beliefs, so that
An
even,
interesting, sorry.
yeah. No, no, so that even briefly, so that even when a therapist, for example, checks the clock, it's not a random event, or even when they're late, it's not a random event. And a good therapist knows that everything has meaning.
Mm.
And if you understand the kind of meaning that the patient ascribes to things, that's your royal road to the unconscious, if you will. But that's how you kind of figure out what, yeah, what's
Yes,
happening.
yeah, exactly. So, yeah, what you're describing is interesting because, yeah, what you're describing is, yeah, sort of the predictive processing model, which is, as you say, like we are constantly generating hypotheses of, these generative models, which is like trying to map the kind of like conditional dependencies, or rather like the kind of what are the generative or causal mechanisms underwriting the sort of the impressions I see. And that then maps very nicely onto the mentalizing. And for those who aren't aware, because I've sort of realized we've sort of been talking about it, just in case anybody is literally just stumbling upon like this kind of whole sort of field and stuff, mentalization based theory on what mentalizing is, it's about understanding that. I suppose it's two aspects, isn't it? It's the being able to understand and imagine one's own mental states, which to most people, when you say that, it's a really, I think people are like, what do you mean? Why would you ever do that? But it's because we take it for granted. We take it for granted that we can symbolize and understand what we're feeling, thinking, and
Ourselves,
wishing.
our own self, yeah.
Right, right. And I think most people, though, can intuit better that it's also speaking to this idea of being able to understand that other people and imagine what other people's wishes, fears, desires are, and that their behavior is underwritten by those motivations. Yeah, sorry, I just thought I'd throw that in.
No, no, exactly, exactly. It's important to define things in case people don't know what each of these term is. And yeah, to me, they're synonymous, right? They're both inferences of the mind, which is to say that they're both trying to reveal something. In the case of mentalizing, it's very much relational, and is
Yes.
understanding the self, understanding your own mental states, and trying to understand other people's mental states. Philosophers don't like that sometimes because they say, oh, you can never know, whatever, but like the point is not to know the truth. The point is to entertain different possible scenarios and kind of like negotiate the truth or reveal it together with another person, rather than thinking a priori, I know the truth, I know what you're thinking, or I don't know anything. So the point is to be dialectic in these things. Anyways, so what we did is that which is not even original, the model itself, again, it's based on Friston's work, and more specifically, it's an adaptation of a different kind of work done by Giles Story, who's the last author. So he actually built the model to talk about splitting and how people idealize other people and then they devalue them, right? And then I took that and I adapted it briefly, and I said, you know what, actually this model, it can be expanded, and it can be better understood as a model of how people think in general, how people mentalize themselves and mentalize others. And essentially, yeah, that's the first element is that it's probabilistic. It's generating this hypothesis, these beliefs about what is happening in the world. The second is that it's about mentalizing. So it's about ways of understanding the self and the other. And the third one is that it's hierarchical. This is very important. So hierarchical in this case means that there's beliefs about beliefs about beliefs and so on and so forth. So this is how you get, and this actually is interesting because people criticize mentalization. I mean, I don't want to go too far, but like people, maybe this is not relevant, but people criticize sometimes mentalizing that it's not psychoanalysis, as you said before. And in some ways they are right, but in other ways they're not right. So if you take psychoanalysis, strictly speaking, psychoanalysis could be defined as being purely about the unconscious. So anything that doesn't have to do with the unconscious is not psychoanalysis, you could argue.
Sure.
So that's where you get the contrast between mentalization and the cognitive behavioral therapies. But you could actually see that Fonagy's supervisor, which I can't remember the name of, but never mind. The point is that there is such a thing as unconscious beliefs, but there's also such a thing as pre-conscious beliefs.
Yes.
And these are like intermediary. So you have conscious beliefs, which is that I know that my name is this, and I know that I have the job at that place, and I go there every morning at 9 a.m. and yada, yada, yada. And I do these kinds of things and yada, yada. This is your conscious beliefs, your conscious narrative about who you are. There is a pre-conscious narrative, which is certain things about yourself that may not be fully transparent to you. Maybe other people know them, but you don't know them. But they're kind of there. They're kind of like if you dig up, you're gonna find them. If you spend a few hours mentalizing, in therapy
Yeah.
or journaling, maybe
It
sometimes.
might be like something like I know deep down, like I've had moments where I've reflected on actually I believe that I'm unlovable, but I don't necessarily walk around all the time thinking it, but it's sort of there, it's more like there. And if I sit in a therapy space for long enough, it sort of comes out.
Exactly. That's a nice point because it might be in the back of your mind, kind of like unconscious, and then you might find yourself doing certain things in life that reflect that belief, but you're not even aware that you're doing those things. You're not even aware that, even though you kind of know, oh, I believe I'm worthless, but then you find that if you go and you analyze yourself, that you may be doing certain things in life that reflect that, and you're not aware of them. So this is, yeah, exactly. Um, and then there's like full hardcore unconscious, traditional psychoanalysis kind of thing,
Yes.
which to be honest, like I don't really know. I mean, most of the times I think that people talk about the unconscious nowadays, they probably mean the pre-conscious stuff, what we just described. Fully unconscious stuff takes years to reveal, if ever. And yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
so and I think that's where the dichotomy comes, right? So um I would classify therapies as based on which kinds of beliefs, because everything is about beliefs in mental health, I believe. I would classify therapies based on what kind of beliefs they're targeting. Dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy is targeting those superficial beliefs, the first level beliefs. Mentalizing targets the second level beliefs, beliefs about beliefs, you know and then full psychoanalysis, which is maybe when you're getting better and you want to dig a bit deeper just because you want to intellectualize your life a little bit more, you go to the full hardcore, I don't know, like maybe like Keynesian psychoanalysis, and you just sit there and you just talk about, signifiers, etc. But
Or like
anyways,
dreams, maybe you might like
or dreams
analyze your
even, yeah,
dreams.
dreams
Yeah.
and hopes and visions and whatever,
Mm-mm.
Um, I don't know. Sorry, sorry if I'm getting off track.
No, no, I think it's in actually quite an understated point actually at times. And I think what are you about to get onto the fact that so mentalization based therapy, yeah, doesn't concern itself with
Exactly,
unconscious.
exactly, exactly. Which is, I asked Peter this question. That's how I came to this. I said, why do some people don't like mentalizing? Why do they say it's not psychoanalysis? And he said, yeah, I think, yeah, I lost the name. Never mind. I'm not gonna say a name and not be correct. But anyways,
Sure.
someone told Peter Fonagy when he was in analysis himself this idea, and that's how he constructed the whole like mentalizing model based on these pre-conscious narratives. And this is the level of the cognitive hierarchy that mentalizing is targeting. And that's why it's quite successful because it's also targeting conscious beliefs, but also like pre-conscious beliefs. So this
Hmm.
is how I would outline the model. And the final property of the model is that it's dynamic, which is to say that, one moment you may be hostile, but the next moment you may be, pretty okay. So it allows for people to change their mind quite quickly, but also in the long run. So you don't see that in personality models often. They just assume boom, in hardcore, like older models of personality. Anyways, so that's what the model is doing. And then essentially what we just did, I don't, I summarized the model for those who are interested in in a blog Substack post by a ways of tab.
Yes,
Um,
I read that. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly.
I
So
can put
that's
that in
where,
the link, yeah, for this video if
yeah,
people
yeah.
want
Thank you. So that's where because the paper is pretty long and it's quite technical at times. But essentially, yeah, that's what the model is. And then what I did, we just performed, I would just briefly describe them as like toy simulations, which
to.
basically means that you can use the model to show how certain things work, how mentalizing works,
Mm-hmm.
and illustrate that personal disorders can be actually understood as relational disorders. And you might say, well, how is that? Why do we need to do that? Blah, blah, blah. Well, I think it was important to do that, to demonstrate it rather than simply say it, right? In this way, I'm demonstrating it using a simulation. And other people who have their own definitions, they feel free to write your own maths and generate your own, ways of defining personality disorder. But I would say that it's impossible because it's too general. So one of the things
Mm-hmm.
that I realized while I was doing that is that it needs to be very specific in order to be able to do certain things. And that's where the idea of, personality disorder doesn't make sense because personality is too general. So that's why it can be more specifically understood as ways of relating to the self and to others. And briefly,
Yes.
the simulations show that well, some of them are basically demonstrating some, archetypal personality dynamics, like loving yourself too much, in which case you're a narcissist. So always mentalizing and saying you're amazing, you're credible, other people are useless, yada, yada, yada. Or maybe you're mentalizing and you're saying, oh, other people, I don't trust them, they're always out to harm me. So you have a very negative, a very hostile model of other people. Again, this is a paranoid sort of like relational personality problem, right? The borderline problem would be something like, I love you, I hate you, kind of thing for the other. And for the self, it would be something like, I have no idea who I am. And the only way I know who I am is by looking at you. And
Yes.
if you tell me, for example, oh, you're amazing at art, then I'm like, oh, I can become an artist. And you can just drop everything and become an artist. And the next day they tell you, actually, you're not a good artist and you're good at, I don't know, like basketball. Then you drop everything and become a. So this is the extreme version of
Sure.
the what Deutsch, a psychoanalyst, said, the as if character that always changes their mind about who they are and they're always changing their identity, etc.
So that yeah, so I think in the paper you sort of not that we've got it, but if you had a graph, the sort of probability distribution, the values, it's like across many, but not very high almost.
Yes,
Or
about
although actually no, because then you've also got the splitting, don't you? Or would that be only for the other in the sense of So suppose you've got 0 to 10 with, I guess, 10 being positive, 0 being negative. It's as though
Yes,
like the values in which a person can find themselves would either be really low or really high.
exactly.
But then
For the
you've
split,
also got the unstable part, sorry, not the unstable part, the diffuse sense of self.
yes, yes.
So
Oh,
that,
yeah, the way I would explain the diffuse sense of self, this is the interesting part, is that so there's the first belief and then there's the second belief. This is where it gets a bit technical, but the idea is that there is no second belief. So you're a function of their environment. So
I
whatever
see.
information comes in overwhelms you and you identify with that instantly, either because you have this belief here is very relaxed. So it's
Mm.
almost like it doesn't exist. But yeah, so the
So
idea is that,
it's not very precise.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So in a way, think about it almost like a confident person and a less sort of like a very confident person would have very precise beliefs about who they are. I am this person. I'm going to do this. I came here to do this. I'm going to do it, you know?
Mm.
A person who's more creative, actually, I would classify this as an aspect of creativity, but maybe like chaos as well. They don't really have a very, and sometimes they do, maybe about their artistic capabilities, but if they're very creative and they're very like kind of like chaotic, they might not have a strong belief about who they're supposed to be, and then they change their interests very easily. They change who they are, they change their belief systems, they change their morals. So again, this kind of shows you that this identity stuff is not really, it's a different, it's its own thing, let's just say, it's not really like, I don't think that you can use this necessarily to define people with borderline. People with borderline, the reason they have maybe some identity problems is, as I said before, that they focus too much on other people and they just don't develop a sense of self. So
Interesting.
it's
So
not
so
like
it's not,
they, yeah, it's not
sorry.
structural. Go on, yeah.
So it's not, so it's that as opposed to the, it's not so much as a function of the splitting. It's more as a function of this focus. But that's really
Yeah,
interesting
yeah.
because that does comport very much with mentalization-based theory in terms of the development of the sense of self, in that, which Peter and Mary Target and all of these guys have been sort of showing for 30 years in their sort of developmental studies is, you know, a lack of contingent mark mirroring, so whereby the constitutional self of the baby and the child and those affective states aren't mirrored back, that in time on average can lead to a borderline personality presentation, which is sort of uh, well, because it leads into what you're saying. It's like the person doesn't know, they don't know who they are, so they're constantly having to just basically go on in the
Yes.
environment.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So, and we showed that in the simulation. This is probably like the most interesting part, I think, one of my favorite parts. This sort of like lack of identity, as you just said, right? Is imagine there is marked mirroring, but it's very inconsistent. So one
Mm,
moment in the marked mirroring, I show you either with my body language or with my actual verbal language, my baby, that you're a good person. Okay, fair enough. I'm a good person. Then I show you you're a bad person. Then I show you, oh,
mm,
maybe you're good and maybe you're bad, and maybe you're okay. If you do that on average, as you just said, over the long run, imagine like it's from 0 to 5. Like this is very like simplistic, right? But like imagine you're stacking points on from 0 to 5. If you
mm,
stack a lot of points on 5, oh, you're amazing, you're amazing, you're amazing, and there is evidence for that actually. So historically, people thought that narcissistic personality disorder or narcissistic personality organizations, they emerge from being shamed or being abused as a child. But there is
mm,
emerging evidence showing that if the more you love the person, the more of a perfect parent you want to be, the more you are succumbing to the child's needs. The child wants an iPad, they get an iPad. The child wants an iPhone, they get an iPhone. The child wants this, they get that. Whatever they want, we give them that. And we always tell them they're amazing, or we always tell them they're incredible. That's how you stack up on the 5 and they become narcissistic. If you stack it up the other way, they become, this kind of ignores your baseline temperament, which might come
yes.
that, maybe your temperament is that you already have 5 points here on 0, and you already feel like, depressive, and maybe I give you a 5 here and now you're a split or something. The very like simplistic way of thinking about it. But imagine that the borderline child is completely flat when they come out because they have no sense of who they are. Maybe that's a genetic thing, we don't know. But then, and then you also give them like a little bit of everything, then it continues being flat, and then they have no
Mm,
belief about themselves. They don't know who they
mm.
are. They could at any moment they could be horrible or they could be incredible, and it literally is entirely conditioned on the
mm,
other person because it
mm.
was always conditioned on the other person.
Yes. Yes, and this is really something I'm really interested about, right, is this kind of whole because at times, right, so I think I put it to you in an email, right? I'm very much and I've been toying around with some ideas around again, I know not everyone will agree with it, and it's just a sort of to see, if you were to posit it, where would it take us? But I I am of the opinion that what we call borderline personality disorder could be construed as a traumatizing disorder or of a traumatizing nature, right? And you can say that whether or not you adopt a object relational of like the Kernberg model, or if you take a mentalization based model, because fundamentally, you know, interestingly, actually, even PTSD, right? The criterion A of PTSD is like experience of serious injury or death, or fear of serious injury or death, right? Well, if we're thinking psychodynamically, if we're really psychologists, well, we're concerned with the psyche and the self. And actually, a child, the paranoid schizoid position is very much literally that is what it's typified by. It's this sort of fear of destruction, of an annihilation. I mean, Fairbairn even, Ronald Fairbairn, I was recently reading some of his stuff, although it was through Thomas Ogden. But, interesting, he even says this, the child, it's a trauma when the mother doesn't actually attend to the child. But what's interestingly, is like, sorry, what I'm saying is because it's true. What you were talking about and the mentalization based stuff speaks about is actually well whether or not because there's a lot of disagreement though, because people often get caught up on the etiology of it being traumatic because there is about I think 70 some studies show something like 70% of individuals with a BPD diagnosis have experienced an actual kind of like trauma, right? But
Very
actually
severe as
that's
well.
right, but that's quite a narrow definition of trauma, or it's sort of going on.
Yes, yes,
Yeah. And so then and as I think you can make the point, regardless of whether that exists or not, the configuration of or the psychological configuration that a person ends up with is traumatizing because they're perennially contending with a mind that can't contend with things, and it's sort of lost in fear of annihilation because in a way the Kernberg organization of borderline personality, it's more differentiated and granulated, but it's in a way it's the paranoid schizoid position in which a person's own anger isn't mentalized or metabolized, so they fear it's coming outwards inwards, and that's what like possibly why often people with BPD are getting so angry is because they're terrified you're going to get angry with them and all of this. But the point being is that some people then go, well, actually temperaments is really significant thing, and it's not just traumatizing because it's temperamental. You have to account for the temperament. Your second model, I think, actually in the simulation accounts for temperament, doesn't it? In that you sort of
yes,
you lay out the model to account for the fact that somebody could come into the world, into their environment and relations, whereby they make it challenging, or it's challenging for the others to relate to that child, and
exactly.
which I think makes sense. But that doesn't then not mean that it isn't still really challenging and whether or not you want to use the
Yes.
word traumatizing, but I would use the word traumatizing for the child.
Yes, no, that's an excellent point. And I have my own term actually. I don't think it's I don't think it's in the scientific sort of like psychological language yet. I like to call them developmental failings rather
Okay,
than trauma. So
sure.
although I would agree with you, it's traumatic for the person. So here's where as you just said, there is patients who say, oh, it's just complex PTSD. There is or that it's just about trauma, and everything is trauma, and this is trauma, and this is trauma, right? And then there is a class of clinicians who say, well, what about the temperament, and if everything is trauma, nothing is trauma, and yada yada yada. I feel like I'm more likely to side with the patients, um, and the reason is because what they're trying to say, um, and I think what the actual clinicians and the people who are so temperamental, like they're obsessed with temperament, as if it's like as if then why don't you just call it temperamental disorder, I guess, if you're so obsessed with temperament,
Mm,
right? And you call it personality disorder. But anyways, that's again because you're conflating what I said before, the second idea, which is relational disorder, with the third idea, which is character disorder. They're conflating
mm,
character with personality and temperament. But anyways, put that aside for a moment. I agree with the patients and you in that they are traumatic, but what the patient is trying to say, and we don't understand them, is that there was something in development that they needed. It's not like they wanted it, they actually needed it
Mm.
and they didn't get it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as we said in the temperament language, everyone has different temperaments, so everyone has different needs. And it is impossible for us to know every single need that they have and attend to every single need. And that's why Winnicott said, all you need to do is just be a good enough parent, a good enough mother, you know?
Yeah,
So you just need to be good enough. You don't need to be perfect. If you're perfect,
sure.
actually, you develop you create a narcissistic
Yeah,
brain.
he actually spoke
You
of that.
know?
You need to frustrate the child, but in a
Exactly.
titrating it. Yeah, sorry.
Exactly. But there is some times where you're still good enough, but you may miss out as a parent. And this is not to blame parents or anything. You know, no parent is perfect. That's why probably like everyone needs to go to therapy and just discuss like briefly like the specific kind of failures, of parental failures they've experienced. You know, because everyone
Mm,
has experienced at least a single or two or three. There isn't a perfect family out there. So you have experience, and that's why everything is trauma
mm,
subjectively, but I would call it a developmental failing, right?
sure. Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
maybe you wanted to show your parent that you drew something and you wanted them to say this is amazing, even though it was shit, it wasn't a good drawing, you know, and they didn't pay attention to you in that moment, or maybe your dad worked too many hours and you didn't get as much love or attention as you wanted from him, you know.
Yes.
Maybe it's something as subtle as that. And some stupid clinician is going to come and say this is not traumatic, and they're right in some way. It's not really traumatic, you know.
Yeah, it's
If you
yes.
go in
Compared
Mongolia,
to
yeah,
yes,
if you go in
yes, yes,
Mongolia, you
yes.
know, and you see the children, they're riding horses and they're falling from horses and they break their legs, and the parents don't even do anything. They just let them be, you know.
Yeah.
So what's trauma to one person is not trauma for another person. That's why I would simply say that's why there's also a class of people with BPD who say we don't want it to be called, you know, trauma, because then, you know, we don't feel like we've had enough trauma to
Yes.
qualify. So I would simply say, not to disagree with you, I agree with you 100%. I think we agree, we share the same sentiment on the idea. I would call it a developmental failing, you know?
Yes.
And I think Winnicott actually used that term. So there's
He
something that
did.
you need, you didn't get, there's a gap, there's a lack somewhere,
Yes.
and that's the thing that's coming up now, manifesting in this way, and it's causing trouble to other people, um and then they blame you and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, I'm fully open to that, and I think it is a difficult thing, isn't it? The terminology of trauma, because in a way you do sort of you don't want to. You need terms to denote to particular things because otherwise you, like in the same way you lose meaning when you call everything personality disorder. Well, if you call everything trauma, then it's sort of it because you lack precision, and actually, witnessing the death of somebody is slightly different to not having, being mirrored possibly. But what I find particularly interesting, yeah, as you say, is this. I don't see though where some people like make the claim that temperament somehow then makes it as though it sort of denounces or excludes the environment as still being significantly implicated, because a child that comes into the world who's temperamentally, I don't know, sensitive, or it's highly neurotic or more higher neuroticism, um, yeah, it doesn't mean that their developmental failures, let's say there's a developmental failure, it was still a developmental failure. It doesn't mean it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Of course, yeah. I mean, the two interact in complicated ways, and of course, everyone. The problem with many people is that they think of these terms linearly. That's the intuitive way of thinking about them. You know, this thing causes this thing, and this thing causes that thing, and
Yes, of
whatever.
course.
But they interact in very complicated ways that we don't really fully understand. But I agree with you that one doesn't preclude the other doesn't preclude the other
Yeah,
one.
and interestingly, I think some people who say that they'll say, "Oh, it's not linear," and yet they then sort of speak as temperament in this really linear way, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
No, I agree with
but
you. I again, I don't really like, one-dimensional explanation. Hopefully my explanation is not one-dimensional now that I'm thinking about it, but, but yeah, I think it's as I said before, going back to the first quote, like the illusion of knowing everything and thinking that you're right. and thinking that, of course, and actually one of the interesting things about the simulation too, just to briefly outline it so that the people who believe in this temperamental stuff, they can understand the difference, is that yes, a child can have some temperamental traits that make them more, difficult, so quote unquote, but those traits they don't, if you just let them be. Actually, we don't know what will happen because if you let them be, because we're always flooded with sensory information, right? So we always interacting with people. You can either interact with them in a way that amplifies them and reinforces them, or you can relate to them in a way that dismantles them, that actually ameliorates them. So even if someone has some, like extreme temperamental personality trait, they're not, like from the moment they're born, let's just say, right? They have that. They're not gonna you interact with them, and by virtue of interacting with them, you're shaping that trait. So
Yes.
it's never, so even the idea, what I'm trying to say is that even the idea of a temperamental trait doesn't make sense, because the only way that you can speak of temperament is when the baby is like literally just now born, and that's
Yeah, yeah,
who
yeah.
they are, right? That's who they are. They came prepackaged in this
Yeah,
way,
yeah.
but then as soon as they come here and we interact with them, we are shaping them as much as they're shaping us, and vice versa, and everything. And so it's no longer temperament. It's no longer, and that's why there's a difference between personality traits and temperamental traits. Temperamental traits, again, is what you come with in the world, but then personality traits, serious personality researchers, like, for example, Chris Hopwood, Aidan Wright, and other people, they acknowledge that these traits are dynamic and that they change over time. There's a lot of
Yes.
research right now on how traits change, how they change. Bladern, that's another researcher, and she's doing this research showing, mapping out specific events and how the personality traits change in response to those events. As you said, like witnessing a death of someone, or maybe just losing someone, might have a spike in your going through a divorce. There's a spike in neuroticism, and then people become more emotionally stable again. So life events at the general level, but also life events. Right now, you're shaping me and I'm shaping you in some way. We're creating the third, the
Yeah, yeah,
combination
the
of third
analytic
level,
third. Yeah.
So even at the granular level in everyday situations, but also at the macro level in years, there's changes in this trait. So there's never a temperamental trait. There's never a temperamental disorder. It
Yes.
cannot be.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense actually. Maybe ADHD when you're adolescents, it's temperamental, but then obviously like you're changing as you grow. If you're also taking medication, you're also changing. It becomes something different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that makes me think. Sorry, you're just talking there about the dynamical nature of things, and actually, in a way, as you say, because you temperament, it so quickly is in almost immediately is becoming shaped by the environment. So I suppose so then summarizing the generative model stuff, how would you summarize it in terms of kind of the simulations and broadly what did
Yeah,
it show?
I acknowledge I didn't actually speak about the simulations much, but yeah, so the first set of simulations shows specific personal difficulties, as we just said, being very narcissistic or being very paranoid or being both, in which case you're more split, or not knowing who you are. The second simulation shows how do those things emerge in the first place. And the argument there is that they emerge in relationships. So you
Mm,
can start with no temperamental proclivity, as we just said, and you just pick up from what is in your environment, and you learn to hate people because you know people around you are harsh, and you want to shield yourself, and so you learn to become more suspicious, and there's some epistemic mistrust involved there as well. Or you
sure.
learn to be clinging to people and to desperately, like needing someone always to protect you, because again there was something harsh in your environment and there was one person who helped you, and now you desperately need other people. You're more dependent on
Mm,
others, and so on and so forth. And then the last simulation shows that the only way, so in a sense, sorry, there is a second part to the second simulation, which is what we just said about temperament, that you can be born and you might already relate to others in a more like, I wouldn't say like negative way, just in a non-optimal way, right? So you
mhm.
might be a very shy or a very sensitive child, and you're more likely to cry when your mom picks you up. There's actually a lot of I have a friend who works at perinatal care, and she says there's so many like mothers who have mentalizing problems. They come and they say like, my baby hates me, you know. So like these are things that I'm not, we're not trying to blame anyone. We're not trying to blame the
Of
child or
course.
the
Yeah, yeah,
parent,
yeah, 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 yeah.
but we have to acknowledge that these are actual, like these are things that I never thought that they, unless I saw them with my own eyes and heard people say them, I would have never believed that, you know, these problems exist in real life, but they do exist. So imagine your mother picks you up, you come, you're born, and you're a perfectly fine baby, but you're just more sensitive and you cry often. And your
Mm-hmm.
mom cannot regulate herself very well, let alone you, right? You know, and then she sees you crying all the time, and she's like, "Oh my God, my baby hates me." And she says that, like, "My baby hates me." And when the father picks up the baby's okay, but when I pick it up, it always cries and yada yada yada. You know, and then you
Mm-hmm.
have to teach them how to mentalize better and understand that the baby's not doing that intentionally, you know, like it's just a sensitive baby, and you need to regulate yourself first, and then you need to regulate your own baby, and so on and so forth. So, but the point of this simulation is to demonstrate precisely this idea that the baby might be a bit more sensitive, a bit more challenging at times, but the parent also fails in regulate that baby, and then the failure propagates over and over, and it comes then in childhood and in adolescence, and then it escalates if it doesn't, and then that's where you get this sort of like developmental failing, right? That a crucial function that needed to happen since you were a baby doesn't happen. And you might say, well, Orestes, like, does that actually predict? Yeah, of course, we have studies. As you said, there is Fonagy's book, just read it. Like it outlines so many studies that show that if you fail to regulate the baby from a very young age, it could be very catastrophic later on. It's not deterministic. It's not like if you fail to regulate your baby once, you know, it will become a criminal or something, you know. But if you consistently do that, you're gonna have, at the very least, you're gonna have some challenging relationships later on. That's why I say they're relational disorders, right? Because that's all they are. That's the fundamental dysfunction. You fail to relate to your baby in a specific way. Then they fail
Mm.
to relate back to you when they grow up, and then it escalates from there.
And I think we have another piece of evidence for this, right? Which
Mhm.
your paper then this paper speaks to, and is an extension of, well, many other pieces of work, and well, the whole outcomes of what the whole field is starting to show is, once upon a time, if somebody was given a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, it was sort of seen as, well, sorry, you're kind of unlucky, you know, maybe we'll just try and keep you out the back somewhere. That's a sort of approach, you know, a bit of a caricature, but you know, you then talk about within that paper, revitalizing the self and others.
Exactly, and that's the last simulation. Yeah.
Right. Oh, okay. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, no, exactly. And this leads to the last simulation exactly, which is that, so if the failure is that you learn yourself and the other in a maladaptive way, in a dysfunctional way, then the third simulation shows that the way that you revitalize, the way that you change the way you view yourself and others, again, can only happen in the context of relationships. So
Mm,
this is where we argue that the therapist is essentially this person who, to put it in, I think it's schema therapy terms, that is reparenting you in some way, is re-regulating you, is doing what, you know, your parents perhaps should have done when you were developing and you were facing these developmental failings that I've mentioned previously, or let's call them mini traumas. Let's just say mini misfits, misfailures, whatever, in
sure.
mirroring and mentalizing by your parents. What they're doing right now is that they're showing you. It's not enough to just talk to someone. That's why skills therapy, you know, Jonathan Shedler would say like skills therapy doesn't work. Uh, it's because you cannot just tell someone, oh, here's how to mentalize. You have to show them. You have to actually show them. you
Mm,
have to you have to engage in a relationship with them, of course,
mm,
within the confines of therapy. Some people say, you know, some people may not may think that the therapeutic relationship is artificial, but it has to be, because there need to be boundaries, I guess. But it's still a relationship, and it can be a very meaningful relationship.
mm,
And within that relationship, you are relating to the therapist in particular ways. If the therapist is attuned and is relationally trained, then they will detect that you're making some mistakes in the ways that you're relating to them. Of course,
Mm.
they're also making mistakes when they're relating to you. A good therapist would also say, I have a relational problem sometimes, and I'm relating to you maybe in a reactive way. Maybe I'm cutting you off. Maybe you wanted to say something before, and I cut you off because I want to speak all the time or something, you know? So a good therapist also has supervision, and they also find out when they fail relationally.
Yes.
But anyways, just go back to the simulation. The idea is that the patient is expected to come to therapy and relate to the therapist. And when they were relating to the therapist, they're gonna make some mistakes. And when they make those mistakes, the therapist is gonna say, "Oh, see, you just did that." You don't say it like that, of course, but you say, "Okay, I wonder like what this means." You know, like you just panicked because I was 5 minutes late. You know, like what does that mean? And that's
Mm.
where people come and say, this is what transference focused psychotherapy is, this is what mentalization based therapy is, schema therapy is playing the same ideas. You're acting in this mode, you're becoming, in this moment, I triggered you and you're behaving in the insecure child mode, they call it, or something. Or you're behaving
Mm.
in the angry child mode or something. And then they give them names just to help the patients understand that they're entering the states of relating that are unproductive. I would just call them unproductive. They're unproductive
Mm.
ways of relating. I like to think of them as productive ways of relating, where you're trying to repair something. We're a team together and we're trying to repair our relationship, our own relationship. When we fail, we're trying to repair it.
Mm-hmm.
Or there's unhelpful ways where when you're engaging in those difficulties, you just say, screw everything and whatever. And that's unhelpful and unproductive. And what you're doing in therapy is you're slowly repairing those ways of relating by better relating to the patients, by showing them that there's a better way to relate to them, by showing them that when they scream or when they're angry at you, you actually take it in and you listen and you regulate it, and then you are reflecting it back to them. And then they
Yes.
internalize that, and then they build a good relationship with you in the here and now. And then Fonagy extends that. It says, that's not enough. That's a good first step, but that's not enough. The way you see that that the patient is actually genuinely improving, because as I said before, there's the therapeutic frame. The therapeutic relationship is a really good relationship, but it's not. This is the harsh reality that many therapists will never acknowledge. It's not a genuine relationship. It will never be, because there's a boundary. We're not friends. I'm here to teach you or show you perhaps a way of being, but we're not friends at the end of the day. Unfortunately, this is the unfortunate reality.
Yes.
Yeah, this is.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I would
And
say there's yeah. I think what it is that there is there's it's not you what, and I don't think you're saying this. There is a reality to the relationship, and that
yes,
it's very real actually. But as you say, what Peter's suggesting as well, and which you're highlighting, is that it's not the same as, and there's not as much, maybe
yes,
there is I think Jonathan Shedler says this about therapy. It's, and the reason he's talking about it in the context of like ChatGPT is saying no, it's pointless because there's no skin in the game. So there is skin in the game in the therapy with the therapist, but
yes,
which I think what you're saying is not as much skin in the game as there is when I'm in the world, in my community, with my friends, with my potential
exactly, exactly.
partners. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, yes, yes. And to be honest, we don't know which one is more therapeutic. Maybe it turns out to be that the actual therapeutic relationship is more therapeutic. But what Peter would say is that you see the most benefits. I reactivate your capacity to trust other people, which I don't really agree with. Because I don't think that we should. And he says, like, sometimes we make the mistake and we make our patients trust other people more easily, which is not what we should be doing, right? Because maybe they're in a.
Are you saying you don't necessarily agree with that?
No, no, he said it himself that sometimes we teach patients to be more, epistemic trust stuff, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
be
yeah.
more
I've read a
trustful.
couple of those papers. They're really good. Yeah.
They're really good. But I mean, we should be teaching them to judge people according to who the people are. We definitely should be teaching them to be trustful, but not always trustful. So
Yeah.
it's a very dialectic thing again.
Yeah.
The problem I have with the epistemic trust concept is it loses this dialectic aspect that,
Okay.
actually you can start and be suspicious of everyone. It's a good stance to be, and then slowly, when you slowly trust people, trust them But
I think I
yeah.
see what you're getting at. Yes, that
Yeah,
it's
but
very dialectic and sort of dynamic.
not fully, and then also go back to be a bit suspicious, and then, but it's very difficult to get the balance, and it's very difficult
Mm.
to teach someone how to do that because every relationship is different, and yeah, obviously
And
we're not experts in that either.
And I,
So
yeah,
yeah,
and I think also, sorry, because I think I cut you up a bit, but what
no,
you
no,
were
go for it, go
perhaps
for it.
getting at as well is that, yeah, Peter, I think he said it when I spoke to him actually, he uses the term like this virtuous cycle. So what the therapist is sort of doing is trying to engender or offer sort of certain affordances of in terms of relating to others, which they can explore in the world. Um,
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Maybe the trust thing is not really like so important as the other thing is, which is teaching them just broad ways of relating. Not even teaching them,
yeah,
just like they teach themselves in a way. It's not like
yeah,
we have the knowledge and we're just providing it here. We're the expert relators or
mm,
whatever, you know,
yeah,
relationship experts or whatever. But they learn on their own how to better relate to this particular person that they have in front of them, which is a therapist. And then they take that knowledge, they take that skill set, they go in the real world, they form other relationships, they improve other relationships. You know, there's this, you know, commonly people say, and that's the thing that's therapeutic. Peter Fonagy would say like that, that they can actually improve the relationships in the real life. And I can attest to that, you know, like speaking from personal experience, a therapist once told me, I don't know where he got that information from. It's very wise, I guess. But he said, don't, maybe he took it from someone else. I don't know. But he said, don't, Orestes, you can definitely blame your parents for all the horrible things that they did to you, as every parent definitely did some horrible stuff to their children. But you should never forget to also acknowledge all the positive things that they did to you. And if you can, you should improve your relationship with them rather than blame them, which is actually, you see a lot of therapies right now, and maybe they're not even therapies from Shedler's point of view. Um, but if to the best of your ability, you should, if you have the opportunity, maybe you don't always have the opportunity. We're not saying that everyone could improve a particular relationship. Maybe a relationship is broken beyond repair. You just have to accept
mm,
it. But if you can, it would be a good idea to try and repair it. Um, and just the process of trying, you offer your hand if they want to take it and they want to be, and they, you know, then that's a good
mm,
thing. That would actually heal you. That would definitely heal you. And then
yes,
that's the main message of relational psychotherapy. You go in the real world, you build new relationships, but also repair broken previous relationships. Sometimes you let them go completely, sometimes you fix it a little bit, sometimes you build a new one. And in that
sure.
in that way, you learn how to better relate. And yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about all of this and what you're describing there and what the modeling stuff you show is, it makes me think of because when you use the word relational psychotherapy, sometimes people, I don't know if you've seen it, but I've seen some, I don't know, blogs, papers, people sort of sometimes talk about they're critical of relational psychotherapy or psychoanalysis because they say, well, what, it's just subjective then, is it? It's just all constructed. Versus they'll then counterpart that to say there's a more sort of objective approach in which no, we're sort of saying that the difficulties reside within the individual person object relations or something, right?
I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
Yeah,
Go
but
go for it.
I don't think that I think that is a false dichotomy, and actually I think
Mm-hmm.
this is what the predictive processing stuff maybe as well allows is that it no
Yes,
it resides in the individual and it's constrained by the other as they relate to the individual. So it's not either
100%.
or.
100%, 100%, 100%. Yeah. I feel like this false dichotomy was drawn, as you just outlined, because some relational psychoanalysts have been using a lot of weird metaphorical terms that
Right.
make, you know, and so I kind of like I kind of see where the other side comes from, and it says, oh, if everything, you know, you the way you're speaking is as everything is intersubjective, you know, like everything
Mm,
is just you know, you are constructed in this moment. I only exist in this moment and not the previous or the next, and I
mm.
am who I am now, and I will never be this person again, or kind of thing, you know. So I kind of see like, yeah, there is some metaphorical language that can be interpreted in this way, but I agree with you 100% that the correct way of thinking about this correct, whatever, maybe a more accurate way of looking at things is that you have these mental representations, you have these beliefs about yourself and others. You enter a relationship or a social situation, and some of those beliefs, not all of them, some of them get activated. So as an
Mm,
example, everyone has the capacity for violence, and everyone has the capacity to kill someone else. So if you, and I bet if you were to watch, a dear, a loved one being murdered, let's say, you would become
mm,
aggressive, right?
mm.
So that's like one example where you might be the most calm person on the planet. You might never be aggressive, but in the moment you become aggressive because you see an extreme situation, right? So in the
Yes.
same way, the way you relate to someone else is by having those mental representations, those beliefs about yourself and others, and in the moment they get activated by the other, and then you engage in that particular way of relating. And that is exactly why the third simulation argues that the therapist needs to activate good ways of relating, not bad ways of relating, right? So if they have a
Yes.
patient in front of them, they shouldn't react. If the patient becomes emotional or whatever, they shouldn't, or if the patient becomes angry and they starts, screaming at the therapist. Of course, the therapist should be able to defend themselves as well, but they should try to the best of their ability to contain their anger and not relate angrily back, and or
Mm,
even retaliate later on, because you might just
mm,
say in the moment I'm okay, but then later on I retaliate towards the patient. No,
mm.
you should be able to, you should find a way to relate to them in a good way so that you can bring out the best from them and then take it from there.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And that kind of
Yeah.
like reminds me, but very briefly, like a patient who said, I started to become better when I went into a completely, I moved town or whatever, and I went to a new place, and I just started like making new friends there, and no one even knew who I was. No one knew this person was psychotic, had psychosis. No one knew my history with mental health and blah, blah, blah. And they didn't think I was weird, and that was it. And it's like that I found
Yeah.
that, so sometimes if someone knows already, like if you see someone's file and you're like, oh, borderline,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and then
yeah.
you talk to them, you're already
Yeah,
predisposed.
it's a
it's
real
it's
issue. I mean, I'm not. This isn't something. I mean, you're saying it, and it's not new. But and again, it comes back to that blog I sort of wrote, which is that it's and it comes back to the quotes you put at the beginning. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like we think when we have a module or we think we just we've described it, we've named it. We know exactly what we're dealing with here. Um, and
And it
we
becomes
and that
self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, and so that comes on to, I think maybe the sort of last sort of part or paper we could talk about. I think, well, it's definitely one paper you spoke about. Is this kind of epistemic justice and injustice,
Oh
and
yeah.
yeah, and I know you cited Jay Watts, who wrote a really good paper as well, and I know you in your paper you're agreeing with her, but you're also disagreeing with her. So I suppose. Can I ask, yeah, partly what was the motivation for that? Because there's two aspects here to your work in a way. You've got this sort of more, I don't know what and maybe they're not actually maybe they're not as separate as I've just sort of supposed they were, but they're sort of more empirical or scientific. And then you're putting your foot in this pond of the more, I don't know what you'd call it really, not maybe philosophical possibly, but or maybe they're not. Maybe it's anyway. What? Yeah. How did you end up writing that paper, and what were you saying in it?
I think, to be honest, I mean, a lot of the things that I've done, people tell me I have ADHD or something. I don't know, maybe I do or whatever, but I just see something, and every time I see something and I read it, I get an idea, and then I want to write about that idea. And that's how most of the papers come into being, to be honest. It's not like I
Okay,
pre-plan them. It's not like I get the idea. Very rarely do I get the idea just by, walking or whatever. I
I
usually read
see.
something. I usually read something or many things, and I see like I see something that's wrong with them, or something that I don't agree with. I personally don't agree with, and I'm very opinionated, and I just write my thoughts as a kind of like commentary. So that's how this particular paper came into play, but also many other papers. So even the illusion of personality, even the generative model, I read Zhao's paper, another sort of like
I
computational
see.
psychiatry stuff. And I thought, oh, this is applicable to mentalizing. This is the same thing as mentalizing, but no one wrote about mentalizing in these terms. No one wrote about the relationships in these terms. No one wrote about personality disorder in these terms. So I just thought maybe I should just write this little thing, bringing everything together. That's kind of how I approach things. And this particular commentary, you're right, it is actually a bit different because I don't know, you're right, I don't know how it is different. Maybe it's more, it is it is a bit more philosophical, but it's also maybe, I don't know, ethical,
Yeah.
philosophical,
Yeah.
and yeah, let's just leave it at that. Ethical, philosophical. And I just thought, yeah, I thought when I read Jay Watts's piece, if she's watching this, I love her work. I have nothing against people. I have nothing against any person. I did, you know, I don't mean to. I'm very disagreeable only when it comes to these ideas, not in real life.
Yes.
Real life, I'm very agreeable. But yeah. I'm not, you know.
I, know,
Anyways,
I fully get that. I really do get that. And I think
yes.
it can, I don't know about you, but I think at times
Thank you.
that can be, I can find myself frustrated with that because maybe a little bit like you, maybe not to the same extent, but can be very disagreeable with ideas. And I think sometimes there's this confusion, and maybe it's not helped because often we're operating on like Twitter or LinkedIn or something like that. And then it can come across as like, oh, I hope you don't think I'm actually like slating you. No, it's just
Hating you
your
or something. Yeah.
ideas. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
your
exactly,
ideas.
exactly. I think people who are very again, the trade openness to experience, right? And they're very interested in ideas. They focus so much on the idea that they forget there's an entire human being behind the idea, you know, that actually it
Mm,
came from someone's mind. So
mm,
to them it's very personal, to you it's very impersonal.
mm.
To us, I guess, yeah, and vice versa. They would think that our ideas, you know, they would view them very impersonally, but we would view them personally. Anyways, but yeah, so I guess when I read her piece, I just felt that there was something missing, and the thing that was missing is that there was a couple of things. One of the sentiments was that BPD doesn't exist, um, which I think that, you know, BPD as a diagnostic category, I definitely believe, or even as a thing that people identify with, it exists. So that's the first argument. So as long as there's even at least one patient on this planet Earth, person with lived experience, however they want to identify, that identifies with this concept, regardless of the name, forget about the name, then that concept is real in my estimation, right? So of course we
Mhm.
can disagree about how we conceptualize that. We can disagree about the nomenclature, about the naming and the labeling and everything. And I fundamentally disagree with the labeling, but I still believe it exists. And
Right.
we just need to change the way we see it so that we can help the patients who identify with it. That's the first argument.
Yes.
And then another argument is that again, it's an extension of the first, is that I think she was arguing, that's how I read it, that a lot of people with BPD, they can just simply be reclassified as having autism or as having other kinds of like neurodiversities or as having what was it, a complex trauma, right?
Mm.
And I definitely think that there's a lot of misdiagnosis, but not all of the cases can be, you know, completely moved from this diagnostic category to another diagnostic category, you know?
Yeah.
And as I said before, there's a lot of patients who have not experienced severe trauma. They have some developmental failing from your perspective, some mini trauma, right? But they don't have, for example, like severe sexual, physical, emotional abuse. Maybe they have
Mm.
some neglect. Maybe they have some other sort of like developmental failures where the parents didn't give them the attention that they wanted, that they needed, you know? And as I said before, people with BPD, people with a diagnosis of BPD, when I spoke to some of them, when I had my clinical post in a clinical trial primarily, uh, and they used to say that, you know, I used to be described when I was young as being a very sensitive person. So maybe they just needed some extra attention. Maybe that's the fundamental problem that they had, that they didn't receive that extra bit of attention, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, anyway, so all of that to say that I don't feel like I felt like she was only speaking about a specific class of patients who were severely abused, or that they had some other kind of like neurodiversity, and neglected other kinds of patients who may not had those experiences, and they
Mm.
still have the same difficulties as the other patients, like similar difficulties, not the same ones, and they still meet the criteria, and maybe they can just be better classified, in my opinion, as having a relational disorder or an emotional disorder. So that's the main, that's why I wrote it very briefly, like, yeah, just because I thought it's important to provide a fuller picture. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Yeah, because I think that's it. And you say in it, actually, what could end up happening, one of the implications possibly is if uh, the implications of, sorry, what she's suggesting, it could end up being the the very thing she's hoping or trying to protect, or sort of epistemic justice, it ends up leading to epistemic injustice because the person's then left without any meaningful construct. So whilst borderline personality, yes, it has, it's almost like a impoverished in terms of its hermeneutics. Not having anything, well, then that might make somebody even more confused, possibly. Is that
Exactly,
what you're
exactly.
saying?
Because there's already a class of patients who strongly identify with this concept, and they have, having been through years of maybe therapy, they might have developed a different way of viewing the concept, and they're okay with the way they view the concept. Maybe they view it in relational terms, as I just described.
Mm,
Maybe, and this goes back to the other idea, I guess. Like, there's some people who told me, like, oh, like, but even if we rename them, it's never going to change. People would still stigmatize them, yada yada yada. And I say yeah, fair enough. I never argued for that. I don't believe that just renaming them would solve everything.
mm,
Um, but I do believe that renaming them is a very nice first step, so that we can transform the way at least the mental health professionals are viewing it. So, if anything, what I'm arguing is that I want primarily the mental health professionals to destigmatize it within the mental health professionals themselves, within the profession itself. I don't think we've done a good job destigmatizing anything in terms of the public. We changed so many names, but the
mm,
public still is discriminating against depression, anxiety, psychosis. Um, Sometimes they view them as failures of characters, failures of the person. We just don't be depressed, go to the gym, yada yada yada, right? So I don't think that they have done a good job destigmatizing anything yet, but I think that we can definitely do a better job destigmatizing it within the profession. You see that in other terms, autism is relatively destigmatized within the profession.
yeah.
Mental retardation, it used to be called sorry, it used to be called mental retardation. Now it's called intellectual disability. Now we view it as a disability. At least the professionals have a much better understanding. They understand that these people, they will always have some difficulties, and we just need to support them.
Yes.
There is still some stigma, of course, within the profession itself, but it's
Do you
getting
know
better.
what? Yeah, and do you know what this all makes me think of, Orestis? Is
Yeah, yeah,
actually
go
when
ahead.
we were a moment ago when we were talking, and I sort of was trying to describe differentiate your paper and called it philosophical. You then went, well, maybe it's also ethical as well. I'll leave it at that. The word that was at the tip of my tongue, but I didn't say it, and I say it tentatively, and I'm not saying it's a word I might use. It's like in a way, there's an element of activism in it.
I was gonna say right now, yeah, I was gonna say activism.
Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
maybe in a way it's like one of those terms. It's like, oh, do we say we are because you're trying to be a scientist or a professional? But actually it's almost like if you're being really honest with yourself, even if you're not, that's not what you're going into it for, you almost can't help but end up doing that. And that again makes me think of the paper you've written recently, I think, with Peter. I mean, it's more, I don't know if it's a paper, you'd call it a paper or a letter, but to the I think it's a paper to the IC, was it to the
ICD 11,
ICD?
ICD
Yeah.
11 work group members, whatever it is. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. So I mean
I'm actually.
that is a form of
Oh, this
activism.
is this is a paper that every single person who saw it before it wasn't published. Okay, so just the history a little bit. There is a group of people who make decisions about how to update classification systems, right?
Mm,
In the US, it's the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. but in Europe, it's the ICD-11. It's the International Classification of Diseases. So there's many diseases in there. It's interesting that they call it diseases because there are no mental diseases. But anyways, a disease,
Right.
I don't want to be too technical, but a disease implies that we know what causes it. A
Yes.
disorder implies that there could be many different causes and we don't know, and it differs between people, right?
Yeah.
That's the difference between a disorder and disease. But anyways, so anyhow, the people the people who are deciding about the personality disorders, I know one of them is Peter Tyrer. I spoke to him a couple of times. The other one is Michael Crawford. I was working under his supervision in a clinical trial as that was one of my jobs, so I know him as
Mm.
well. And then there's a couple more people. I don't know all of them. It's a big group, obviously. Those are two main figures as an example. Another one is Roger Mulder, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I hope I am. Anyhow, and some of these people together, they got together and they wrote an up in World Psychiatry. World Psychiatry is the most impactful journal created by in psychiatry, created by this guy called Mario Maj. And it's interesting because this guy just solo created the journal. And the way it was created is because he had this email list of a bunch of psychiatrists that he knew worldwide. And he started sending them papers that he really liked, which I also do sometimes, to friends and colleagues. Um, yeah, anyways, and then it just developed into a project that he created, and he created the journal. And then so instead of like sending papers that he likes, he invites people to write in World Psychiatry. Sometimes people submit, and that's it. That it's just him, and he's just having this journal, and it came like the most cited journal and everything. So
Wow.
right now, like, yeah, exactly. So right now, like, the most a lot of impactful papers by experts on many topics are published in World Psychiatry, right?
Okay.
Um, yeah. So so these people were invited, and they wrote about some recent developments about the classification of personality disorder, the international, classification of personality disorder in Europe at least. And I just read it, and yeah, there was there was a moment near the end, kind of like triggered me, a sentence saying something like, oh, we shouldn't just rename them. This is a very simplistic way of dealing with these things, whatever. And this is the reason why I decided to write the paper, um, just to like let off my some steam, if you will. But
Okay.
like Lincoln was, I'm going very like chaotically, but like Lincoln, you had this strategy. I think it was Lincoln. I don't know, some other U.S. president, where he would write letters, like literally just like cursing everyone and saying, "You guys are all useless. La, 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 what are you doing?" And then he would just lock them in his cabinet and never send them off, just to let off some steam, right?
Right.
Just to like, and I tried to do that. I can never let them in my cabinet. Maybe I'm too impulsive. So I invited a bunch of people, actually, many psychologists that I know, to be part of the paper. And they all said, no, I don't want to, I think it's a bit too much. Orestes, like, don't do this to yourself. You are new, don't pick up fights. I was perfectly respectful, I think, in the letter. But basically what I said in the letter is that um, what they concluded is that, oh, we need to do more research and find out, what
Mm.
these things are. And what I said in the letter, in in a sense, is that you guys are saying you're going to do more research and see what's happening, but you haven't looked at all the research that has already been done. So I think what you need
Yes.
to do instead is you need to do literally just revise it based on the existing knowledge, because not all of the clinical knowledge has been implanted in this uh, in this um, in these diagnostic systems. As an example, before, the fact that you use personality traits to define personality disorder doesn't make any sense. We can move into a system whereby there is a couple of traits that define a given mental disorder, and then there's like the relational interpersonal traits that define the personality disorders. So that then you
Mm.
have like only four kinds of disorders: emotional disorders, behavioral disorders, um, cognitive perceptual disorders, and the personality relational disorders.
Yeah.
We could even move the classification system as simple as that. And then under each branch, there is specific traits and specific symptoms. And the difference between traits and symptoms is that traits are more longer lasting. So if you're depressed, but you're depressed under the qualifier of the trait, maybe you could be said to have a depressive personality style. Like that's just who you
Mm.
are. You're just more likely to be neurotic. But maybe you're
Yeah.
depressed because it's a more reactive form of depression because I don't know, like your parents just died or your partner died or something like that. Anyway, so there could be many different ways that you can build a diagnostic system, and many people internationally have been arguing for the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, which is basically what I just said: emotional
Yeah.
disorders, behavioral disorders, relational disorders, cognitive perceptual disorders. And you could be said to have one of them, but even though you have one of them, so imagine a patient, sorry, I'm going a bit off track, but that's what I was trying
It's
to
fine.
argue very briefly in the letter, that there is a better system whereby a patient comes in,
Mm.
instead of saying you have this, you have that, whatever, we do a full assessment and we cover pretty much everything. We cover the four major dimensions of human experience, right? The way you feel, the way you think, the way you behave, the way you relate to other humans and to yourself, right? So these are the
Hmm.
four major dimensions. We can find ways to make a concise assessment of most of them. And then we can say, okay, here's your profile. You come in, and this is your personality organization, actually. This is your psychology fully, and every patient would have that, and they would be like, you may be scoring, you may have unstable emotions, unstable behaviors, but everything else is fine. Or you may, and then you just have that thing. Or maybe you have unstable relationships, and behaviorally you're intact, you have job, you have you're relatively okay in your behaviors, but you have also a bit of unstable emotions, but only in the context of relationships. Boom, there you go. Here's your relational diagnosis, and here's also your other profiles. So the point is that just because you have one of them doesn't mean that don't have the other ones. But
Right.
but always, and this is my argument, is that always there's going to be one of them that is more impaired than the other ones, and there's going to be one of those dimensions that the patient wants to improve, right?
Yes.
So they come in and they always have an idea, maybe not always, but they have some idea of what they want to, what their difficulties are. And they're coming now. They didn't come yesterday. They didn't come a year ago. They came now, which means that there's something happening now. We can just ask them. We can classify it based on exactly what it is, rather than saying you have a disorder of all of personality, which makes zero sense. We can just say you have a disorder or you have a problem in the way you feel, the way you think, the way you behave, the way you relate. And then we choose the one domain where that needs a little bit more attention. That's
Yes, that's interesting because I was going to almost do a steel man. I was going to ask you a question, but you've sort of answered it there because I was going to ask you, well, what about say a Kernberg approach might say, well, somebody with psychosis who's psychotic, so they would
Mhm.
be have a psychotic personality organization. They would arguably fall under in one of these approaches, like where you're describing the traits, they would have cognitive perceptual difficulties. But actually, anybody who has met somebody or knows somebody with, who's psychotic, yes, it's different to, let's say, the borderline organization, in the sense that they're not basically from an object relational perspective, they're not imbuing the world with their own to the same extent. They're not sort of projecting their own objects onto the world in a sense, in representations. So basically what I'm saying is though, is that they still have relational difficulties. So it's a relational difficulty and it's a cognitive perceptual difficulty. But as you're
Exactly.
saying, one of them might be more, you'd see one as more predominant possibly or something.
Exactly. I would definitely see one. I mean, this goes back to the failures of classification themselves. Not every single person can be neatly put into a box. You could
Mm.
even make the case, as some of my supervisors made the case. Patrick Luyten told me about this. He said, but Orestis, depression isn't depression a relational disorder? Someone who comes into the clinic, most of the people who come right nowadays in the clinic and they're depressed and they say they're depressed is because they have bad relationships.
Mm.
If they were to fix the ways they're relating to others, maybe they get better. I was like, yeah, there you go. That's also a relational disorder. So it really is difficult to classify people and neatly put them into boxes. And that's exactly where these dimensional approaches shine. And that's why they're very much in line with the traditional psychoanalytic way of thinking, because traditional psychoanalysis didn't put people into categories. It just simply said, you have this, again, organization, which is a collection of traits, right? all of them. They just and interestingly, every mental disorder or every mental condition is a personality condition. Everything is
Mm.
equally personality based. So
Yes, yeah.
so what I'm arguing for, and you actually I think you were saying the same thing when you speak about Kernberg, is that when a patient comes into play into the clinic, and you have to actually like conceptualize what they're having. Uh, a good way of thinking about it is there's all these dimensions of human experience, and instead of classifying you, usually in the US, I know at least classification is mainly for insurance purposes.
All
Um,
right.
but maybe it's less so in the UK, I guess. But instead of thinking in terms of like which category to put you in, right? You think, okay, you come in here. There is this major personality psychological dimensions, and maybe we can include some other dimensions, as you just mentioned. Maybe we can include the way you perceive reality, the way you project your own objects, or things like that. Maybe we can include some mechanisms. In fact, Peter and other psychoanalysts have always been arguing that the diagnostic systems are too descriptive and they need to become more mechanistic. Maybe that's a
Mm.
better way of organizing it. I don't know, but the fundamental point that I'm trying to make is that all of these dimensions, it's not like some of these dimensions are more relevant to some patients than others, which they are, I guess, is that when you're assessing someone, you should consider as many dimensions as possible and just view them there, and just look at the whole picture, and then say, okay,
Mm.
this patient has this problem and this problem and this problem, and then yeah, maybe they have one problem more than others, and you can just classify them based on that problem. Although you don't have to, as you said, maybe they're equally psychotic and equally relationally, having problems, and so they just have a, I don't know, schizotypal kind of like a pathology, I guess, however you
Mm.
want to conceptualize it.
Yes. And just coming back, I don't know why it's just coming to my mind, but coming back to because you were talking about with that paper to the ICD and how some people saying, "Oh, be careful," but you got Pete Fonagy co-authored it, didn't he?
Yeah, eventually, Peter, not eventually. I don't know why Peter agrees to these things. He always edits it in the paper when before he's actually in there. He says, I'm very blunt. I'm very, sometimes I border on the borderline. I don't know, on the side of rudeness even sometimes. But he's more diplomatic. He comes in and he softens the language a little bit and says, well, actually, yeah, that it's not a bad, it's not a bad. He didn't actually disagree with that. He said that, he did advise me. He said you should focus on other things right now. Stop writing these papers, like, no, 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 not stop writing them, but just like focus on other things. Your PhD, for example, right? Uh,
Sort of focusing on what? Sorry, on the.
on the letters that I'm writing, sometimes I'm a bit more,
Oh, I
I'm a
see,
bit
on the
yeah,
letters.
on the letters that I'm writing to other people. Sometimes I'm a bit rude, let's just say, because I don't like when people say personality disorders, yada yada yada. I also don't like when I don't know, maybe this is just the way I'm reading them. I don't know. Maybe I have nothing again, I have nothing against these people, but I just when I find, I guess the other letter that I'm having in mind right now is and the one that I authored on my own is the most recent one
Oh, the response,
against,
yeah, to
yeah,
the
to
Psychiatric Times
in
article.
Psychiatric Times, exactly, by Mark Ruffalo and another person. I don't know the other
I think it's
person.
Agostino, maybe. I can't remember. Something.
Yeah, maybe I think so.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and they in that paper they essentially implied that whenever you criticize BPD, you have BPD. And with that, I don't just disagree. I disagree on so many levels. It is impossible to describe how much I disagree with that statement. And so like that thing got me really fired
Mm,
up. And I
mm.
was like, F everything, fuck everything. I'm just gonna write it on my own, and I'm gonna just put it out, and I'm not gonna even tell anyone. We didn't discuss it with Fonag or anything. He didn't even see that. He's not in that paper. But that one, I was so against that idea that
Mm.
I had to write something about it and put it out there. I had to do that.
Sure.
So
Well,
this is
yeah,
where the activism,
yeah,
as you
yeah.
said, I
And
do believe it's a bit activistic, but
well, it
at
is,
least
yeah.
activism predicated on some, scientific and empirical research.
Yeah, and
So
that's why I'm curious, is like where does that fire come from? Do you think, is it more from the science? Is it because you're such a scientist, you're observing the flaws in the very logic being used? Or is it without, you don't have to go into details, does it also come just from, do you think, your own personality maybe or something? I don't know.
Or I mean, yeah, maybe many, many things, personal experiences. I knew some people who had this diagnosis. Um, then the second one, maybe my personality is just like that. As I said, if I see something and I don't actually, yes, if I see something that I don't agree with, I will definitely raise my voice and say, I don't agree with that, you know? And even in class, I got into trouble when I was younger, and then later on in university, I would just say to the teacher, I just think that's completely wrong, and I think you shouldn't be teaching it in this way, you know, you know? So
Really, yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just who I am as
But
well.
yeah,
Yeah.
I read that response, and I don't think it was rude. I think
Okay,
it
thank you.
was, you
Thank you.
know,
Yeah.
I don't know if someone said to you it was. I
No,
thought it
no one
was,
said. Let me just say that. Yeah, they didn't say it about that. Peter used to say about my previous letters when I
yes,
was
yes,
writing
yes. So
them,
you're just, yeah, that was,
softening the language a little bit before he put his
well,
name on to say I would phrase it in this way to be a little bit more diplomatic. So maybe I internalized that, and now the way I write letters is a bit more,
mm.
it's a bit nicer, maybe. But yeah,
I think, in that one anyway, the way I read it, I thought, it was fair. It was, as you actually
thank
made
you.
clear, you were playing the same game that was being played in that article. And yes, it was quite forthright, I thought, but sometimes I think being forthright is important if we're passionate and if we're able to actually make the case. I thought it was respectful personally, but I get why because it wasn't personal, but because there was an element of you're directing it at somebody and how they've written, it can come across as that. In the same way, like we were talking about, if you're on Twitter and you disagree with someone on Twitter, it's it can seem personal. And for me, anyway, I don't know. Some people maybe people are different in how much they identify with ideas. But to me, I would
Mm.
like to think if I write anything, not that I write anywhere near as much as people like Mark Ruffalo or yourself or others, but if I were to write something or even say something, someone can vehemently disagree with me and actually even highlight, the sort of ways I've been speaking and sort of say, well, what if I were to speak like that? I would like to think I could differentiate that and not take that as an affront to me as a person, but rather just a reflection to possibly. It's that, do you know what the word that came to my mind when you were talking earlier about how you come up with ideas? And you were saying, well, I actually, whenever I write a paper, it's never just out of the blue, it's a response. And to me, it's very
Mm.
Hegelian in that it's that sort of
Mm.
thesis,
Antithesis,
antithesis. Yeah. And
synthesis. Yeah.
it's that because if we don't have that, and but I guess like you're speaking to, it is hard, and I don't know. It's not for. It's only for you to really work out, the tone and approach you want to take. But yeah, I actually enjoy that paper, and actually
Mm.
I
Thank you.
enjoy to an extent the original paper, even though I also did disagree with it, because it helps me perhaps, and maybe like yourself, better understand really what I think. Because I don't agree with like that. So at least I
That's
know
a
I
good
don't
point.
see it like that.
That's a really good point. Yeah, yeah. And I realized kind of like the ways clinicians see these patients sometimes based on how they speak about these patients, based on the way they describe them, they write about them, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, you're right. Actually, we kind of owe to them in a way that we have our own ideas by de-identifying with their ideas, anti-identifying with them in a
Yes.
way. And yeah.
And I don't. The other thing I would say as well is, and I've actually had some sort of discourse with the authors on like social
Mm,
platforms, and the other
mm,
thing I try to do that is even if I vehemently disagree with someone or disagree with someone, whether I'm just being sort of like I'm kidding myself, but I'd like to think I'm not. Even if I know I'm fairly sure I don't agree with that, I try to remain open to maybe I'm just yet to see things in the way in which they're seeing it. And if I were able to, then I would come around. Albeit, I think in this case
I,
I don't agree with it. But does that make sense? So that just because I'm disagreeing with
I
you
know.
doesn't mean in principle, I could still come around to your way of seeing things. I just don't, given the evidence and given the rationale and the way in which it's being argued, I don't agree with it.
Yes, this reminds me of a quote by Freud, um, who said, who admitted, he said, I don't like these patients they cause me such a great discomfort. They seem to be so alien to all that is human, and I find myself like unable to relate to them. And this is what makes me a horrible psychiatrist. This is an actual quote from Freud, but he was talking about psychotic patients.
Uh,
And the fact that when someone is in an extremely psychotic state, I mean, I'm getting goosebumps, but yeah, it is, the truth is, it is scary, like there are scary things out there. There are scary people out there. There are, for example, as I said before, antisocial people who, another psychiatrist was telling me this story of a patient who would literally kidnap. He was part of a gang in London, and he would just kidnap people. He would put them in a warehouse, and he would pour over them gasoline, and then he would light up a match and be like, "Ha ha 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 ha! Have a match. Guess when are you gonna die? In 5 minutes or in 2 minutes?" It's just, and it's just like, and he would just laugh at them, and he would just, and he said, "I didn't kill anyone. I was just doing it because I had so much fun doing that, and I
mm,
love doing that. And if I could do that, I would do it again." And this is
mm.
where I draw the line, kind of like, between the character disorder and the kind of like relational disorder. To be honest, you are right. Maybe there is this other thing that, the more you see, the more, maybe you get red pilled, whatever they say these days, I don't know, or that you kind of like change the way the perspective on some kinds of phenomena, psychiatric phenomena. I don't know. I don't have too much clinical experience. What I do know though is that, yeah, there okay, I don't know. I don't know where their perspective is coming from. Maybe it's coming out of fear. Maybe it's coming out of they've seen too much and they know too much. Who knows? But what I do know is that the kinds of patients that I saw, I didn't see what they are describing. Maybe they saw some other patients that I never got a chance to see.
Mm.
Maybe we're describing, maybe we're talking about different things. In other words, is what I'm trying to say. Maybe we're talking about completely different things. Maybe they have something completely different in mind when they discuss these things than what I have in mind. In my mind, I have a person who was traumatized and is not a perfect little victim. Sometimes they're impulsive, sometimes they're reactive, emotionally reactive,
Mm.
sometimes they're emotionally unstable. Sometimes they're gonna shout. They're not gonna be physically aggressive, and they're gonna yeah. And that's the
Yes.
kind of archetype that I have in my mind when I'm speaking about these things. Maybe again, as I said, maybe we need to classify people better so that, the second person the earlier person I just described, the antisocial person who almost, killed someone by lighting them up on fire multiple times, and they were genuinely like, what's the word that describes someone who gains pleasure from seeing, sadistic.
Sadistic.
Yeah, that kind of like level of like sadism and the enjoyment could receive an entire different classification on its own. um
So just so I'm
I don't
clear,
know.
you've had this thought of the Freud quote and then this example in because I was talking about the how did it remind you? Does that make
Oh, sorry.
sense?
Yeah, I thought what you meant is that, when you say you talk to them and they say certain things, maybe they have, maybe you say you don't. I don't know how it came to my mind, but I thought you meant that. No, no, sorry. Okay, here's what came in my mind. In my mind, what came is this sort of like literature that shows that sometimes younger therapists are much better than older therapists because, and actually the reason they're better is because they're much more curious. They don't know anything. They come with little presupposition. They don't know what borderline is. When I started interacting with, I had no idea. I just didn't know. I
Oh, I
just,
see, I see, I
and they
see.
had no presuppositions.
Yes, and so
They
maybe
don't
people
know,
with
oh, exactly. They don't put people in labels or in boxes or whatever. And they just say, I just want to know who you are as a person. Just please tell me. And then they
yes.
just literally look at the human forward. Of course, not every young therapist is better than the older therapist, but there is some evidence to show that. And people who don't look at, the evidence, they wouldn't know that. But that's what I had in mind. And then I thought about Freud, who said that, and I thought maybe Freud had too much experience. Maybe
I
Marco Ruffalo
see.
had too much experience. Maybe we're too young. And as you said,
Yes.
maybe when I grow older and maybe I'll change my mind or something. Um,
That's it. Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's the sentiment and disposition I try to have is like, yes, I would see my current understanding, I really disagree, and I'm quite strong in sometimes strongly, but it doesn't mean I don't still respect necessarily, your work, your opinions, and the fact that I might still learn. I might still learn. And as you said, what you're speaking about is like interesting that anecdote of Freud about how maybe Freud was sort of like because he had so much experience or something.
he
He,
saw too many
yeah.
psychotic patients, I guess, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I definitely, yeah, I don't know about particulars, but I mean, I can relate to it myself. I mean, for sure, having worked in mental health at times, I've become very much aware of this idea. I didn't conceptualize it like that, but for me, the limits of my own compassion. It's like I'd like to think I'm a
Basically.
compassionate person, right? Of course, I'd like to think that, but then I've had encounters where I've really been tested, and gosh, I don't know if I don't know why. Where's the compassionate hit? Like, where should I almost like? It's like, should I have compassion? Maybe I should be compassionate. Why am I not feeling compassion? And again, thinking psychoanalytically, well, to a degree, we all have a superego. We all have a certain, these values, morals that have been inscribed and sort of in. We're in, and we're told, certain people, but for whatever reason, some people are able to work with some people with ease, which other people, their compassion won't go there for some reason, and I don't
Exactly,
exclude
exactly.
myself from that. I wouldn't,
Every person has
yeah.
their own limits.
Mm,
And I guess it just depends on whether you can, again, relate to a person. Like, do you relate to this person's life? Um, who knows? Like a person who's completely losing touch with reality and they can't communicate. I have my other supervisor, his name is Richard Bental, who is an expert on psychosis, wrote a very famous book, Madness Explained. And he did say, like, you know, um, I actually enjoy working with these people, with psychotic people, but other people don't, like he enjoys talking to them because there's
mm,
symbolism, there's literally Young also wrote about that. There's a lot of like symbolism to be found in the psychotic sort of like delusions, and ways of thinking. And some people find that intellectually stimulating and interesting, and but other people like Freud might say, well, this person is completely losing touch with reality and with everything that is human. I don't like to talk to them, and this makes me a bad psychiatrist. I think that makes him a good psychiatrist because at least he
yes,
was able to acknowledge it, and
yes.
then you can just find a way to relate to
Well,
the patients that
because
you can relate.
if you didn't acknowledge it, well, what, you might then walk in and try and support the person, but are you really going to be supporting them?
Exactly, exactly. At least have the courage to admit I cannot work with this population. Someone else, should
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah, and
Hopefully
it
they
could
will.
be, it could be something even like less, someone might see it as more benign, but it might be somebody who had, I don't know, a personal relative had like dementia or something, like I don't know, their father might have had dementia, and they just, for whatever reason, then find it really challenging to work with that population. Does that mean that they can't then be an effective professional with other patients? Yeah, and who knows? Maybe then actually one day though, again, it's not the other, and this is the other thing, right? It comes back to the dynamical nature of things, or yeah, this kind of thing is like again, and it comes back to whether it's personality, whether it's working with particular patients, or whether it's with engaging with other people's ideas who I don't current. It's right now, currently, that's how I see things, but it might change.
Change, exactly, exactly. No, 100%, 100%. People grow, people mature, people become more wise, and they can
Mm,
definitely change their entire career even, change the way they look at the world, change the way that they look at the people. And one of the, I guess, the interesting things about life is that the more people you meet, the more you learn how to relate to different kinds of, people from completely, there's parts of the world that we don't even know, and they live a completely different lifestyle than the lifestyle that we're living. We can't relate to those people, but if you were to meet them, if you were to talk to them, maybe one day you could. That's
mm. Yeah, interesting. So, all right, well, I guess we could start to wrap up because, gosh, I can't believe how fast time goes. We're on
yeah.
1:22. So I'm curious then. So what, you've got a year left on your PhD?
So yeah, so I have funding for 2 years, thankfully, because I don't think I can finish in 1 year. So, but yeah, this is the third year that I'm coming in right now, and there's a fourth year. Hopefully, in this third year, there's going to be some empirical papers coming out.
Oh,
If
nice.
if everything goes well, if everything goes well, let's see. Hopefully, yeah.
Oh, well, maybe in a year or two I can reach out again and
100%. I
um,
would I would love to talk again and actually like summarize my thesis if it ever is finished. Hopefully, yeah, it will be. Yeah, and then I can explain maybe like what the studies show, etc.
yeah,
Should
yeah. Well, I'd be up for that because I mean, I can't believe how quickly 3 hours is almost gone. It's been,
It's been 3 hours? Oh, okay.
I think it has. Has it?
I think so. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it has.
Read
Yeah.
20. Yeah, yeah.
It's been great though, Orestis. I've really enjoyed talking. And I think, as I said in my emails, I've really enjoyed reading your papers. I mean, I think the fact is you're doing your PhD, so you're sort of in the nascency of, I guess, your career. But I have no doubts that yeah, it's really important the work you're doing. It's a really important part, I think, of the wider conversation that needs to be had. Where it ends up, where the field ends up with definitions and conceptualizations. But coming back to that, I think what you're doing, if anything, is you're here's the thesis, and you're going, well, what about this? What about if it's over here? And I think, whether it ends up being over there, it's important to have that consideration. Yeah.
I agree 100%. I just think that if there's one thing I can just like put out there in the papers now and whatever it is that I say is that like don't believe anything that you read, I guess, and also challenge the things that you read and challenge the ideas that you have.
Mm,
This idea that it's a disorder of personality, I also had an argument with Mark Ruffalo on Twitter, and he started saying, "Oh, but it's been around for like centuries." First of all, not centuries, maybe like 1 century, like 100 something years.
mm,
I don't know. Um, so not centuries. The borderline idea. So yeah, just and who knows? Like maybe in 1,000 or in 100 or 200 years, there's never gonna be there's not gonna be a concept of borderline. Although it's been a very long time actually that it's been there. Anyway, what am I saying? What I'm saying is that um, challenge the ideas that we have and don't just like assume that just because it's been there for a long time, it's true. We can definitely test ideas. We can definitely prove them that they're not, that they don't make sense, or we can prove them that there's a better way of thinking about them. There is such a
yes.
thing as a personality. There is such a thing as personality extremeness, and there is some people who have personality quirks, if you want to think of it in that way. But do they have disorders? Not really. We can think about them in more specific terms: emotional disorder, behavioral
Mm,
disorder, relational disorder, yada yada yada. That's the
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, and also you've got a Substack, which I see you started. I mean, is that something you're planning to continue, do you think, or are you too busy with your PhD or what?
No, no, I'll definitely continue it. But yeah, it's been busy now with taking some time off and also like doing some other stuff for the PhD. But there will be some posts that would describe some of these ideas in a more accessible way, let's just say, so that anyone who is interested to read about them doesn't have to like just track my publication record and read the publications themselves,
Yeah.
which might be behind paywalls or they might be a bit technical. The
Mm-hmm.
journals require they have some guidelines that I don't really, like, sometimes I don't really enjoy. So the Substack is a really nice way to just outline all of the ideas in a very clear format, however you want to outline them. And then
Mm,
everyone who's interested can read them. And yeah, it's about basically how can we define personality disorder better. And it's about, again, these three ideas that I mentioned, like personality traits, disorders of personality being about disorders of relationships, and the final idea like character disorder, if there even is such a thing, which you would include people who are doing morally, reprehensible stuff, I guess, and they're doing it
mm,
explicitly on purpose. Yeah, people don't like to talk about it because it's less scientific, it's more moral, ethical, right?
mm.
So yeah, we'll see. But I definitely will be posting some stuff soon, hopefully.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, Orestes. Well, yeah, thanks so much. And I wish you all the best going forward with the rest of your PhD.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I do look forward to reading more of your work. And also, I say this well, for yourself, but also I guess to anyone who's listening. You mentioned her earlier, Jay Watts. I am actually hoping and planning to possibly converse with her. So yeah, I'll let you know as well, so you can, because I'm sure you'd enjoy listening to that one as well.
No, 100%. Yeah, I'm subscribed now, so I hit the notification bell and I will
Okay,
get
cool.
get the notification when it's out. But yeah, definitely do let me know. We're gonna keep in touch over email. I'll send you some stuff as well. So like every time I stumble upon something interesting that I think someone might be interested in, I email, a list of people,
Yeah,
and I email them also about my work, trying to like
yeah,
advertise it as much as I can.
yeah,
Anyhow, so yeah, so we're gonna definitely keep in touch. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Great. All right, Restless. Well, enjoy the rest of your day as well.
Thank you. You too. Yeah.
All right, ciao for now.
Bye bye. Thank you.
See you, Rest.